Morning, everyone. Well, full house feels good here this morning. Thank you all for joining us this morning for our third annual Energy Forum. For those of you that I haven't had the opportunity to meet yet, my name is Tim Thompson. I'm the CEO at Lake Region Electric Cooperative. And on behalf of our board of directors at Lake Region Electric Cooperative and all of our wonderful employees who set this event up today, it's my pleasure to welcome all of you to this Energy Forum. As we all know, our energy industry, I need to go, there we go. As we all know, our energy industry is going through rapid change. And that's one of the main reasons why we do things like these energy forums for our members. To demonstrate this change, I just pulled some of the typical headlines out of the news that we see about our industry on an ongoing basis. And many of these topics that I'm going to just click through fairly quickly, we are going to be talking about today, either in the general sessions or in the breakout sessions after lunch. Here's one. Minnesota electric cooperatives seek $970 million in federal clean energy funds. A consortium of rural electric cooperatives, Lake Region being one of those cooperatives, organized by Great River Energy, is preparing a massive joint application for funding under the Empowering Rural America program. We hope to get some federal dollars under this program to do some solar in our service territory. NERC, the North America Electric Reliability Corporation, raises North American power system reliability flags as demand could outstrip supply. You can hear more about NERC in the presentations. Report finds Minnesota outpacing the country in carbon-free electricity. Minnesota House passes bill requiring carbon-free electricity by 2040. Minnesota Utilities hopes surge of big-scale batteries helps transition to clean energy. Coal power plunged again in 2023 and is fading away in the U.S. So what replaces it? The DOE, the Department of Energy, and WAPA, the Western Area Power Administration, who you'll hear more about today, unveil a $1.3 billion commitment to expand and strengthen our nation's grid. We get some of our power from WAPA. MISO, that's maybe a new term too. You'll hear more about that later. MISO is the Mid-Continent Independent System Operator. The MISO board approves $10.3 billion in transmission projects. And this is what they call Tranche 1 or Phase 1 for new transmission lines in the Midwest. MISO has then gone on to propose up to $23 billion in transmission expansion with 765 kilovolt highway as part of a second phase of transmission build-out. Here's a question we get often and in the headlines. Can the power grid handle the growing electric vehicle demand? Utilities play a critical role in EV adoption. Forecasts indicate, you can hear a lot about EVs today, and we have a breakout session for electric vehicles as well. As the industry continues to change, our strategy at Lake Region is to do more member engagement. We want to have a high level of member engagement. We just believe that that builds a stronger cooperative for our future as we strive to be your local trusted source of information. The middle of this slide, that outlined area, that's our electric service territory, 3,200 square miles. Each colorful dot in that area represents a member engagement activity across our system. For the last few years, one of the best examples of that is our Energy Forum here today. You can see a picture there of our Energy Forum last year up in the left-hand corner there. Below that, our annual meeting that we just had last month, a record attendance for our annual meeting. We now have a new annual meeting model where we provide 3 in-person locations for members to attend our annual meeting across our large footprint. And with that, we had over 1,300 members participate in the annual meeting this year. Up in the right-hand corner, this is a new program for us, our Energy Corner, as we call it. We'd love it if more members would sign up for this. It's an online-only member engagement opportunity where we can provide you additional information about Lake Region, about Great River Energy, about the industry in general. If you want to take a little deeper dive on energy issues, this would be a great way to do it online with us. In the bottom right-hand corner of your slide, we still like in-person mini events throughout our service territory. We do things like set up times to invite members into cafes and sit down at a table, have a cup of coffee, and just talk about things that are going on. We really appreciate the member engagement, the communication, and the interaction we have with our membership. We're here to serve you, and we appreciate you so much. As this industry changes like it is, we are also striving to be your local trusted energy services provider. Here's an example of some of the things that your cooperative is doing for members. We were a leader. We were an early adopter of solar. Back in 2012, we put our first solar business plan together to build some community solar projects for our members where members could buy a subscription. Both of those projects sold out. Then we moved on to our Go West solar program. We're an electric cooperative who actually builds and installs ground-mounted solar systems for our members. We're really proud of that, and so thankful that our employees do that. We also offer a generator program, been very popular for people who want to have that peace of mind. If the power goes out or when the power goes out, you've got your own standby generator to automatically come on and power your house through that power outage. This is a great option for you. Our wind solar hybrid, it's been written about quite a bit. It's a very unique project, first of its kind in our country. We partnered with Juhl Energy and GE to do this project. The great thing about this, in one project, we're harnessing both the wind and the sun, and it interconnects directly back into the local distribution grid that you as members of Lake Region already own. So there's no new cost for transmission or anything like that. Local renewable power and interconnecting into the grid and consumed locally by Lake Region members. We also formed a natural gas distribution company. There's areas in our service territory who don't have natural gas. We are now bringing natural gas to 4 small towns, as well as some large family farms and agricultural users, and around some of the lakes area where it's economically feasible. We are helping people switch from propane to heat their home to natural gas. And in that transition, the member saves about $500 per heating season. In today's high inflation area, that's a lot of dough. And if we can help people save money on their energy, we really want to be a part of that. The last slide, picture down here in the corner, the solar opportunity, that is right in front of us today. This new era funding, this is a federal program from the United States Department of Agriculture, the USDA. We are in kind of the final stages of potentially applying for some federal funds under this large consortium to do more solar in our service territory. We're working on an application for these dollars that's due July 8th, and we're working hard on that. We don't know if we're going to get the dollars. We don't know for sure if we're going to do another solar project yet, but maybe by the end of the year we'll have a clearer picture on that. We'd be excited to draw down some of these dollars and use them locally. With that, I want to pause, and I think I saw somebody that I was going to recognize earlier just stepped in the room. And I just want to take a moment to recognize a special guest here. And if I miss anybody, I apologize, but Senator Rob Kupek just walked in here. Thank you so much for being here today. I see Senator Jordan Rasmussen here. That's fantastic. We really appreciate your interest in Lake Region and the energy issues that we are all working through. Also, just want to take an opportunity to thank our moderator for today and our panelists that you're going to hear from. How awesome is it for Lake Region members to be in a room where we can bring in these energy industry experts and have a conversation? I'm really excited for today. With that, I am going to turn it over to Jeff Haas. If you were here last year, Jeff may look a little familiar. He did such a good job last year as our moderator. We twisted his arm, and he willingly came back this year. We're so thankful for Jeff to be here. Jeff is the Director of Member Services, Distributed Energy Resources, and In-Use Strategy at Great River Energy, our generation and transmission cooperative. Jeff.
Well, Thank you, Tim, and yes, definitely thanks to everyone in the audience for being here today. It's a great event. Happy to be here for a second year in a row. As Tim was mentioning, the pace of change that we're experiencing in the economy today with respect to energy and electricity is probably greater than when we first started electrifying. When we look back 100 years, we were electrifying the rural communities. We were looking at the adoption of new electric technologies, and in much the same way, we're looking at that same kind of transition today with new technologies, electric vehicles, air source heat pumps, but also the rapid pace of change, the transition from fossil fuels to renewable energy. At Great River Energy, we're proud to be a partner with Region Electric Cooperative as we look at these opportunities. Tim mentioned the federal funding opportunities. There are so many different opportunities that we can work collaboratively together to bring new technologies, to advance those technologies and improve our economy, our ways of life, and our cost savings with respect to the adoption of those activities. And so, Tim asked me to be the moderator today, and so that means my job is really to try to keep the agenda on time and to get the questions that you all have to the panelists that we have today. We have an incredible amount of information, experts, both here as well as virtually. We do have 3 speakers today that will be speaking virtually from across the country and even across the globe, as a matter of fact. And so what we are going to do is, with those virtual presenters, we'll have an opportunity to take some questions immediately following the presentation. But then with the folks that are here in the room, we're going to get through the content and then really open it up at the conclusion of it for Q&A with all of the presenters. And that's just going to help keep things on time and make sure that we get through the content, and then we can get to those breakout sessions after the event. So with that, I think I'm going to go ahead and introduce our first speaker. That individual is Jim Matheson. Jim Matheson is the Chief Executive Officer for the National Rural Electric Cooperative Association, NRECA. The national service organization that represents more than 900 not-for-profit consumer-owned utilities, consumer-owned electric cooperatives. NRECA members provide service to 42 million people in 48 states. Jim joined NRECA in 2016 following a distinguished career in both the public and private sectors. From 2001 to 2015, Jim served and was elected to serve as the United States representative from Utah for 7 terms. And during his tenure on Capitol Hill, Jim was known as a legislator who was able to work with colleagues across the aisle. Jim was a chief deputy whip for the House Democratic Caucus and served as co-chairman of the Blue Dog Coalition. He was a member of the House Energy and Commerce Committee, as well as the Financial Services, Transportation and Infrastructure, and Science Committees. Prior to entering the government service, Jim worked in the energy industry for several years. And let's please welcome Jim Matheson to the stage.
Well, thank you. I assume you can all hear and see me. It's always a little different when you're virtual and can't see the audience, so I appreciate that introduction and certainly appreciate the chance to spend a few minutes with you. And man, Tim really set it up well with his opening comments about a lot of the exciting, dynamic components of where we are as a country in terms of energy in general and the electric system in particular. Change brings, it's the old saying, change brings both challenges and opportunities, and it's important to look at it from both points of view and mitigate the challenges, but also take advantage of the opportunities. And as a national association, as mentioned, we have 900 electric cooperatives across the country that NRECA represents as their national association. It's an honor to represent the member-owned cooperatives. We're a different model than the rest of the utility sector in terms of the fact that We're owned and governed by the communities that each electric cooperative serves, and that gives us a particular perspective that I think matters because we're owned by the consumers we serve. And nothing against the other utility models that are out there, but for us, that's the 100% view, is the view of that consumer. It's a phrase we use a lot, that member at the end of the line, that last farm, that last business, and how do our decisions affect that member at the end of the line? And that's both at the local level with the electric cooperative, but that's the national level, is the National Association, because we represent electric cooperatives in Washington, D.C., and advocate for electric cooperatives. And it's through that lens of the end use consumer, that drives all of our policy advocacy positions and the way we frame those issues in Washington, D.C. And there's been a lot going on in the electric sector. You've heard, again, in Tim's opening comments about the headlines really point out a lot of the different interesting things going on. If I were to frame a couple of important developments we should keep an eye on, one is demand for electricity in this country is skyrocketing, more so than it has at any time before. It's being driven by a few factors. One is electrification of different sectors that used to use different fuels. Electric vehicles is an obvious one. Transition to electric heat pumps is another, from gas furnaces. So you see more even in agriculture, a lot of diesel irrigation pumps are being replaced with electric irrigation pumps. So there's a big drive to using more electricity in applications where electricity wasn't used in the past. But the other really significant driver of electricity demand in this country is what I call the digitization of our society in terms of data centers and the cloud computing needs that are driven and drive tremendous electricity use. Data centers consume massive amounts of electricity. We're not going back on the way we use computing power today. In fact, we're entering an era where we're going to need even more electricity, and that's artificial intelligence. The expansion of AI represents a massive future demand of electricity in this country. And there's a big race going on right now globally for which country is going to lead the AI movement. Is it going to be the United States? Is it going to be China? And part of how the United States, if it's going to be successful in being the leader in artificial intelligence, it's going to have the resources to make it happen. And that means we're going to need a lot more electric generation than we have today to meet that increasing demand. And the reason I open my comments with talking about this increasing demand dynamic is because this is a business where decisions take time. These are the electric industry. These are capital intensive decisions. Each project that you build, it's not something you turn around in 30 days. It's years to plan and build, and you assume those resources are going to be around for decades in the future as well to serve our consumers. So this is an industry that requires a lot of capital and time to make decisions in a good way. And yet this rising demand places a lot of pressure on the electric sector, not just electric cooperatives, but the whole electric sector. And this rising demand is also a factor in terms of, are we going to be able to keep up and make sure we are able to keep the lights on? Because at the end of the day, the mission of all of the 900 electric cooperatives that I represent, they're all different, they're all local, they have their own circumstances, but they all share one common mission, and that is to serve reliable and affordable power. I mentioned that member at the end of the line, and I always say, we want to make sure every time that member at the end of the line flips the switch, the light goes on. At the end of the month, when they get the bill, we want to make sure they can afford to pay it. And this increasing demand puts some pressure on reliability in this country. It puts pressure because it's hard to build new resources in this country for a lot of reasons. It's hard to get projects permitted. It's hard to get them sited. Supply chain challenges create those delays as well. And so it requires thoughtful approach. It requires an innovative approach. And the partnership that Lake Region has with Great River is your generation and transmission cooperative that provides power to Lake Region. Great River is one of the really thoughtful, innovative electric cooperatives, generation and transmission cooperatives in the whole country. I'm not just saying that because this happens to be a Great River on this meeting, but I have to say that Great River has taken a forward-looking approach, recognized both those challenges and opportunities I mentioned in this transition, and they really have a wonderful approach, in my opinion, to creating value for their consumers. And so I think that that's something that should be noted for this audience based on my view of co-ops around the country. I think you are well served by Great River. You heard mention from Tim about this entity called the North American Reliability Corporation, or NERC is the acronym. They're kind of the grid watchdog for the country. They keep an eye on threats to the grid, risks to the grid, where there's congestion, cybersecurity risk, supply and demand risk. And NERC has been sounding the alarm, quite frankly, for the last few years. They publish reports every year on a forward-looking basis, look at what's the risk to the grid, and they're saying, listen, demand is growing and supply is not keeping up, and this is a problem. This is a problem because the overall excess margin you've got to meet those peak demands is shrinking in this country, in some regions more than others. In fact, in some cases, we're shutting down plants in what NERC's words are the disorderly retirement of plants before the end of their useful life. So in some ways, we're going backwards on electric supply in this country. And that's something that we all need to recognize about wherever we're going on this energy transition to a lower carbon future. There's a question of the timing that makes it work effectively. There's a question of, is there enough electric transmission in the system to move power around in a different configuration for the grid? And is technology really there to take away a significant amount of that always available generation? Battery storage technology is promising, and it exists for roughly 4 hours of storage right now, and that has value to the electric grid, but that's not where it's got to be if you're going to transition away completely from fossil fuel. You're going to need far greater long-duration storage if you want to transition away completely in this country from fossil fuel resources, because the fossil fuel resources are available 24/7, and the intermittent resources, which is primarily wind and solar, are not available 24/7. I know that sounds really obvious, but we have to have that conversation. So the electric sector is clearly transitioning to more renewable energy, more carbon-free energy, and that transition can happen as part of a portfolio. But you've got to also look at the big picture about maintaining that certain amount of power that is always available to maintain reliability. And that's the balancing act that this country is going to have to go through over the next several years during this energy transition period to make sure we keep the lights on. I mentioned the NERC report saying that the growing risk of reliability of this country, specifically they mentioned 19 states, basically from North Dakota, Louisiana, and Minnesota is part of this, where there is increased risk for outages, for rolling blackouts during normal peak circumstances, not the unusual polar vortex extreme cold peak circumstances, for example, but during normal peak circumstances. So we're on the edge. We need to build more generation. We need to build more transmission. And the good news is a lot of folks in the electric sector are trying to do just that. Tim mentioned the programs at the federal level. They're providing some tremendous funding opportunities. This is something that we at NRECA have been working on since the idea was first promoted in January of 2021 when the Biden administration came in. They wanted to create this program called New Era that was $10 billion specifically for electric cooperatives. And we started meeting with the administration and with Congress right then to say, well, let's decide what this really looks like. How's this going to be structured? And the way we wanted to make sure from our perspective was structured was it maintained flexibility for each electric cooperative to have the flexibility to pursue a project that made sense for that cooperative in that local circumstance. Let's be careful to not do a one-size-fits-all. Let's give flexibility where it works. $10 billion is a lot of money. The maximum you could apply for was 10% of that. And then that's that $970 million that Tim mentioned that Great River and the Consortium of Electric Cooperatives in Minnesota is pursuing. The good news is the Biden administration agreed with our approach in terms of how to frame it. Congress agreed with our approach to how to frame it. It went through Congress through the Inflation Reduction Act. It's the law of the land. It's being administered through the Department of Agriculture. We work with the Department of Agriculture to make sure that program is structured in a way to, again, maintain that flexibility. And electric cooperatives, man, did they respond? You know, there's 10 billion of opportunity. We had over 26 billion of requests for that money. It's a very competitive process, and the consortium led by Great River is one that's moved on to the next negotiating stage, which tells you it's a good quality bid, from my opinion. And that's really exciting. So electric cooperatives, given the right incentives, given the opportunity, are prepared to make those significant investments in clean energy. And you've got a classic example right there in terms of the consortium that the Lake region is in with Great River. That's an exciting policy win, quite frankly, for electric cooperatives that took place in the last couple of years. And in that context, I want to mention a second one. Historically, Congress has incented a lot of investment in the energy sector through the tax code, primarily with tax incentives, either accelerated depreciation or tax credits. Well, that's good for people who are in the taxable space, but electric cooperatives are nonprofit. We're not for profit. We don't pay taxes. And so all those incentives, and let's just use the examples of wind and solar, electric cooperatives couldn't get those tax credits because they're not taxable. And so what would happen in the cooperative world is often you'd have a third party developer build the wind farm or the solar farm, take the tax credit, take a profit, and then sell the output to the co-op. But in the Inflation Reduction Act, we got this wonderful new provision in that allows nonprofit entities, both electric cooperatives and municipal utilities, to have access to that same economic benefit of the tax incentives. And it's called direct pay, where the Treasury Department will pay the value of that tax credit to nonprofit entities when they build those types of facilities. I'm here to tell you that is a huge policy win and opens up so much opportunity for electric cooperatives in this country. And I think 10, 15 years from now, we're going to look back and see that that created a level of investment in the electric cooperative sector that is just substantial and remarkable. That we now have access where we can build those facilities, let's say the solar farm, directly. We can own it. We get the benefit of the tax credit. And of course, when I say we, since cooperatives are owned by the consumers that they serve, all that benefit goes straight to the electric bill of the consumer of the electric cooperative. So those are two big policy wins, this $10 billion program at USDA and this direct pay tax credit. Those, I think, I call them generational legislative victories for electric cooperatives. And needless to say, I've already pointed out the cooperatives in Minnesota Lake region and in the consortium with Great River have already acted on that, and you're pursuing those opportunities. And I think that's really an exciting development. It shows when given incentives and flexibility to do what's right in your local area, electric cooperatives step up to the plate and they deliver. On the other hand, there are times when public policy does try to create a one-size-fits-all mandate that forces everyone to do the same thing, and that doesn't always work well for electric cooperatives. Let me give two quick examples, and I know I'm going fast, but I want to leave time to see if anybody had any questions for me. But let me go through these two examples where the one-size-fits-all mandate causes some concern. One is particularly when COVID hit, we got all these supply chain shortages in the electric sector. One of them was on a basic piece of equipment electric utilities use across the country, and those are those electric transformers. Those are those cylinders up on the utility pole that transform the electricity to a lower voltage to go to each house. And with the electrification of our economy, demand for those transformers just been growing and growing, and the supply chain hasn't been able to keep up. Well, at the same time that happened, the Department of Energy decided to mandate a new standard for transformers to get a little more efficiency out of them. It would have completely disrupted the supply chain at a time when we already had enough problems in this country finding transformers for a very minimal efficiency gain. And the Department of Energy was going down that path of just mandating that that's how it's going to be for everyone. I went and met directly with the Secretary of Energy and laid out the reasons why, particularly in this moment, it was exactly the wrong time to be mandating that on the utility sector when we face this supply shortage. And to Department of Energy's credit, after several months and a lot of congressional pressure that we generated as well, they changed the proposed rule and they walked back from that mandate that would have been very onerous on the utility sector. And so that's an example where the one size fits all may have had some reasons why they wanted to do it, but it didn't work in the real world. And we advocated to make sure that that didn't happen, and we were successful. Lastly, I'll point out the big rule that's come out from the EPA that really is mandating either the use of carbon capture and sequestration on coal and natural gas plants. You either use it to capture 90% of your carbon or you shut the plant down. It's a one-size-fits-all mandate. They're mandating a technology that we believe is not proven at commercial scale. And if it's not proven, then EPA can't mandate it. That's what the Clean Air Act says. So that is a very controversial proposal from the EPA. It is in litigation as we speak. I'm hesitant to make absolute predictions, but I think it's going to fail. I don't think the EPA can stand up to the legal review, the judicial review of this proposed rule. But it's an example of, again, a one-size-fits-all, force a technology on everyone, whether it works or not. That's not the way to deal with this transition. We have to have a much more thoughtful approach and acknowledge that different local circumstances have different needs. That the transition. Let's get out of 0 or 100 or all or none conversations on how we're doing this transition, because there's a certain margin that you can decarbonize real easily, and that last increment is really hard and complicated. And so when you have an all or none conversation, you ignore those complexities and you ignore those nuances of the low hanging fruit that's easier to do and the really complicated stuff that last increment may not be achievable in a reasonable way. Let me close with one more comment on what's going on with the electric sector, though, in the context of decarbonization. We need to pull back the lens and not talk just about the electric sector, but our entire economy. And electricity is going to be a key component of how we decarbonize much of the rest of our economy. We need more electricity. I talked about at the start of these comments, electric vehicles, that decarbonizes the transportation sector. Heat pumps, that lowers the carbon footprint for how we heat our homes. But it's going to need more and more reliable electricity to do that. So if we can pull back and look at the whole economy and recognize that as a portfolio, the electric sector may take their carbon emissions from one level to a lower level. If it doesn't get all the way to zero in a short amount of time, that's okay in terms of the net effect on the whole economy, in terms of maintaining to keep that reliable grid. At the end of the day, we need those always available resources that are available 24/7 to keep that reliability. And that's really the approach that NRECA has taken as we look at those policy issues. So Tim, I'm at the and Jeff, I'm at the disadvantaged position of speaking into a laptop camera without knowing if anyone's still paying attention or not. So I may stop for a second here and conclude those remarks and see if anybody has any questions for me.
Yeah, thank you, Jim. Certainly, everyone, you had everyone's attention. So thank you so much for your comments this morning. We can certainly open it up for a few questions. We've got some time here this morning, and I don't think we don't have a mic in the room, so I'll have to relay those questions to you.
That's okay.
But if anyone has a question, yes, ma'am. Okay, great. So the question, Jim, was, there's a balance here between individuals taking on solar generation and doing things at their home versus having the electric cooperative take on those and bring larger systems to the marketplace. Do you think that balance is in check, or should we be focusing more on one side or the other?
Well, it's a question that's kind of the answer's changed over time with the Inflation Reduction Act offering these direct pay tax credits, because before the co-op couldn't take the tax credit, but individuals could, and so the economics argued for individuals that had that advantage. On the other hand, when you build solar plants at scale, it's such a cheaper cost to do it per panel by a factor of 2 to 1. So rooftop is twice as expensive as if you have a larger array of panels that's built at scale. And that's why Lake Region, for example, did community solar, where everybody buys the panels individually, but it's all part of a larger solar field, and you get those benefits of scale. So now we've got so that's the balancing act, is what's the right way to do it for the least cost, and you get benefit of scale, number one, and number two, now you've got the electric cooperative having the ability if to make the investments themselves and get the tax benefit of the solar investment that again would be passed directly to the owners, the cooperatives, or the consumers. So I guess what I'm saying is every individual situation, you got to look at what makes sense, and if an individual wants to put panels on the roof, they should very well go ahead and do that. But the equation for best value to the consumer is changing. And I think that what I would recommend, and in every location it's going to be different, by the way, is having a good dialogue and engagement and conversation between an individual consumer and their electric cooperative. They've all got the same interest in mind, which is reliable, affordable power for that consumer anyway. So having that coordinated conversation about how can we most economically and most effectively make this type of investment, that to the extent those conversations can be encouraged, I think that's the way to make the most informed decision. And I think, as I said, now that with this direct pay opportunity, the electric cooperative actually has a really valuable tool in its toolbox to bring to the table in terms of really creating value for the consumers that they serve.
Great, thank you, Jim. One more question? Oh, sure. Jim, so what is NRDCA doing to advocate for increased baseload plants generation?
Yeah, I think the key here, and I use the term always available, because sometimes what we need is not necessarily where it's running 8,000 hours a year. You need generation that's available when you need it during peaks. So it may be a baseload plant that runs 8,000 hours a year. It may be what we call a peaking plant that only runs 800 hours a year, but you need it during those 800 hours. And so the important thing is to maintain that always available when you need it capacity. Look, we've spoken out against the timing of this EPA rules. One example of where we're really concerned about that. We've suggested that we have to maintain some level of always available power until technology takes you to a different place than where we are today, quite frankly. And because of all that increased demand I mentioned from data centers and artificial intelligence, this is really a really big issue right now. This isn't something we should be talking about for 10 years down the line. We've got significant challenges as a country today. So number one, stop shutting down plants if we can still be running them. I think we got to be careful about taking away existing always available capacity. Number two, you got to be able to build new capacity. So what we have advocated beyond opposing what EPA is trying to do in the short term, we've advocated for permitting reform. It's so hard to build something in this country, and not just a new generating plant. It could be a substation locally. It's really a transmission line. It takes 10 years at a minimum to build a new electric transmission line in this country, often a lot longer. We got to fix this. And I'm not saying that means we throw all our environmental laws to the side. You should go through a process to determine if a project should be built or not. But you've got to have some boundaries around that process. You've got to have a time limit. Let's say 1 year, 2 years, be done. Thumbs up, go for it. Thumbs down, don't do the project. But create some more certainty for anyone trying to build infrastructure in this country. And then we move on, and you've got to put some boundaries on how much litigation can drag it out as well. And it's not just a federal issue, although at federal level is where it really matters with the National Environmental Policy Act. It's also state and local siting laws. So collectively as an industry, we need to talk about having rational, predictable, timely, and fair permitting and siting laws in this country, because to me, we got to build a lot of new stuff to meet this electric demand. I think that's what we're working on at NRECA. Those are the two things I'd mention in response to that question.
All right, thank you, Jim. We're going to do one last question. Gentleman right here.
Sure.
So, yeah, really a question about, the demand equation, what's being done from an advocacy standpoint to open up new programs to improve efficiency, weatherize homes, and really reduce the demand side of the equation.
Appreciate the question because I quite candidly missed talking about that during my remarks, so I appreciate it coming up. Look, this has been a long-standing priority for NRECA. We are, by the way, our members vote, and we have a resolutions process for the policy positions we take, and there is a long-standing effort and advocacy effort on NRECA's part, looking for weatherization programs, efficiency programs, and beyond that, I have to say our members, and sounds like I'm part of the Great River PR department, but demand response efforts, the Great River Energy, they're one of the leaders, and the distribution cooperatives in Minnesota, including Lake Region, in terms of being thoughtful about opportunities to work on the demand side as well. So yes, clearly that's part of the equation. There's no simple fix to this challenge about this growth in electric demand we see coming in this country. And we got to put every option on the table, both on the supply side and on the demand side, as we try to evaluate it. So I didn't have enough coffee this morning to remember all my stuff I needed. So I appreciate the questioner reminding me that is also a very critical part of how we look at these challenges. And it's important that we continue to innovate on that as well. And the exciting thing there is technology is giving us more and more capacity to make advances in how we modulate and control demand in a way. So it really is an exciting time. It's one of those I mentioned challenges and opportunities. That's one of the really neat opportunities that's out there today.
Thank you, Jim. We do have one more last question that I'm going to give you. So, gentleman over here, yes. Thank you. So really a question regarding the current debt in this country, the subsidies that we're dealing with through some of the federal programs. Are we going too fast? And with respect to the energy transition, should we be just rocketing ahead and adopting new technologies and building out things as fast as possible, or should we be kind of trying to moderate that position in light of the cost that is being imposed on the tax base?
Well, I guess I offer a couple of responses to that. I think that the stress and the pressures on this electric grid are unprecedented in terms of growing demand. This situation with data centers and artificial intelligence is of a magnitude like we've never seen before. And in terms of this country's economic and technological competitiveness, we have to have investment in electricity. I just think that's a given. We're onshore. By the way, I should mention one other factor that's associated with this electric demand. We are onshoring a lot more manufacturing right now. All these new computer chip facilities we're onshoring back to the United States, which I think is good for this country, by the way. We're getting away from electric policy here. But those are also significant consumers of electricity. So I think that we always, on a public policy standpoint, have to balance all these decisions, and that's a much broader issue in terms of national debt. But in terms of the electric sector, one way or another, I think significant investments are going to have to be made. You may go back. Let's go back to the headlines Tim showed at his presentation. The huge new investments that the transmission grid is going to have. And they are going to cost money. And whether it's taxpayer money or consumer money, we're going to have to recognize that these investments are an important part of the future of how we operate our electric grid. And so you raise a fair point. As I mentioned earlier, the mission of every electric cooperative is reliable and affordable power for our consumers. And so the affordability question is always top of mind for us at NRECA as we look at the public policy arena. I would just offer one more thought about our membership. And don't know how this applies in Minnesota, but across our 900 electric cooperatives in this country, we serve 92% of all of the persistent poverty counties in America are served by electric cooperatives. So when it comes to cost to our consumers, it matters to every consumer in America. I understand that. But for us, we've got folks that are particularly vulnerable from an economic perspective. And so those cost issues really matter to us, and it's always top of mind. So I guess that's the best I could do to answer that question. If that really was the last one, I do want to say I really appreciate the opportunity to spend some time with you. I really want to congratulate Lake Region for pulling together an event like this. I wish all of our members across the country, all the electric cooperatives would have this kind of opportunity for dialogue and engagement. I think it's just so important that we all continue to share ideas and thoughts with each other. And so I want to really take my hat off to Lake Region for showing that initiative to do this and giving me the opportunity to participate. Again, I acknowledge being remote is a little different than being there, and I would love to have been there, but I've got a graduation of one of my kids, and it just this week was the week where that took precedent for me. But I'm glad I could participate virtually, and really appreciate the opportunity. And I wish you well with the rest of your program.
Great, thank you so much, Jim. Thank you for your time.
Okay, appreciate it.
If I may, I just wanted to recognize two more special guests who are here. Representative Jeff Backer, right here in front, and Representative Tom Murphy, I believe, back here. Thank you for being with us this morning. We really appreciate your interest in these energy issues.
All right, thank you, Tim, and what a great presentation and comments from Jim Matheson. We're going to move on to our next speaker. Derek Moe is going to be providing us with a legislative update from this year's session. Derek Moe started his service as president and CEO of the Minnesota Rural Electric Association in 2014. As Minnesota statewide association, MREA serves all 50 of the state's rural electric cooperatives, providing safety support, education, and training, as well as political and policy leadership. Derek has been married to his wife, Robin, for over 30 years, and they have 3 children. He's a graduate of the University of Minnesota, the University of Iowa, or Idaho, I'm sorry. And California State University, having master's degrees in electrical engineering and the humanities. He's worked in the electric utility industry for over 30 years. Let's welcome Derek.
Yeah, if you want an Iowa grad, you got to have Tim back up at the podium. So he'll do better than I could for sure. But it's also great to follow Jim Matheson, because I like to think of myself as kind of a mini Jim. So Jim is the CEO at the National Organization for Co-ops, so he has 900 cooperative members across the nation that he works with. I'm the CEO at the Minnesota statewide, so we have 50 co-ops here in the state of Minnesota. Jim is a former member of Congress. I once served on a local planning commission. And you didn't get to see Jim standing at the podium, but he's a very tall person. Hopefully you get to see him in person. I like to think of myself as far away. I am tall too, but I'm far away. So, but yeah, great to have a chance to be with you. It's Lake Region. I will kind of touch on a few of the things Jim did, as well as some other things from a state policy perspective. Great to have this event. Really appreciate Lake Region, Tim and the team here putting this together. Really appreciate people that are member owners of Lake Region and people in the community coming out to take time to engage in energy issues with us as a rural electric cooperative family. This is such a great example of the kinds of things that we do to try to stay in touch with our communities, to hear from you and to share our perspective of where the energy world is going. And it's going fast. Wherever it's going fast. That's for sure. There's a lot going on. So great to have a chance to visit about it. These are, co-ops serve a third of the population of the state. Between our 50 cooperative members across the state, and we serve 85% of the land mass. So it's a pretty big, we're a pretty big endeavor in terms of serving the energy needs of the state. As the MREA at the statewide, in addition to working on policy issues, we also work on safety, communication, education, events issues. So that's kind of in a few words some of the main things that we focused on. So if you're going to think about what's the update in terms of policy issues for energy in Minnesota in the recent past, you've probably heard, but it would be remiss, you just sort of have to focus on this as a going-in proposition, because it's the biggest energy policy change in the state in the history of the electric grid, I would say, is not an underestimate. That is that by 2040, 16 short years from now, I'm old enough that 16 years ago seems like yesterday to me. 16 short years from now, we will have an electric grid in the state where all load is served by carbon-free electricity. And that bill was signed about a year ago now, a bill that we were actively engaged in as co-ops, especially really kind of focused on trying to shape that bill some and get some amendments that would help us navigate this rapid transition. There are also some interim targets in this bill. So in addition to having an electric grid that is 100% carbon-free by 2040, you'll achieve some interim targets. 80% carbon-free by 2030, a mere 6 years from now. You can, if you buy a new car, you'll probably get a car loan that's more than 6 years, but we're going to transform 80% of the electric grid's composition in that same amount of time. That's an area where, in particular, we asked for an amendment and did get one, so that for co-ops, that's actually 60% as a target. And this is in the face of a grid that was already rapidly decarbonizing, of course, thankfully, and doing a pretty strong job at it here across the state of Minnesota. According to filings at the Public Utilities Commission prior to this bill passing, where they look at sort of what all the portfolios are for the utilities across Minnesota, we were going to be at 70% carbon-free as a state by 2032. And Great River in particular has been very good, very strong, a leader in the country at getting to these carbon-free goals. Before this bill passed, their metric was going to be to reduce carbon by 80% by 2032. So, and of course, Great River is going to speak specifically about their work also this morning. So they'll speak more to that, but they have been on a very rapid pace of decarbonizing. And this bill will require that as an electric grid across the state, we all not only stay on that pace, but redouble the efforts to get to these new criteria. So we're not the only state that's done this. This slide just kind of tries to give in one slide a sense of, how does Minnesota now compare to the country in terms of this kind of standard? And I want to be clear that it's not like we're the only ones that have adopted this kind of carbon-free standard. So when it comes to getting to 100% carbon-free, I've listed that there's 22 states that either have a mandate, those are those under the mandate column, or a goal to get to 20% carbon-free. But by adopting this standard about a year ago, we've now pole vaulted into a tie for third place in terms of pace. So there's no question that the industry is on a path to decarbonize, and that's going to be important for the entire economy because more of the load, as Jim mentioned, is coming over the electric grid economy-wide. But the pace is very critical to get right and to navigate appropriately, and the pace has been rapidly accelerated by this bill and has now pole vaulted Minnesota into a tie for third place. And that's third place depending on how you think about District of Columbia and Rhode Island, right, who are in first and second place. That reminds me of the old saw about the couple going down the highway, and she says, "How come we can't ever stop anywhere, dear?" And he says, "You tell me where I want to stop, where you want to stop, and I'll be glad to pull over." "What was that blur we just passed?" she says. He said, "That was Rhode Island." So in terms of looking at these standards, we have a very big grid to transform here in the state of Minnesota and a short time to get there. That reminds me of a movie too, actually. So why is this such a big change? It's because we have a lot of resources on the grid today that 16 years from now cannot be. Slow down the shutdown is, whoa, didn't mean to throw my shoe here. Sorry about that. I'll try not to touch that. About 60% of every dollar spent for your electric bill supports the stuff that I'm trying to summarize in this slide, pays for the generation assets. The electric utility grid is a very capital-intensive industry. Mostly we have rates in order to pay for infrastructure that has been developed and is going to be counted on over time to serve electricity to communities. And specifically, roughly, national average, about 60% of those costs are to pay investments in generation costs. So this is a big transformational deal in terms of how are we going to pay and how are we going to navigate this. And the slide on, the pie chart on the left shows in 2021 what those resources were for the state of Minnesota. And by 2040, what that means in terms of, we got to get coal to zero, we got to get gas to zero. We're clearly going to have massive continued increases in wind and solar energy to be achieving these metrics. One of the good things about what happened in this bill is that hydropower is now classified as a clean resource in the state of Minnesota. Jim is going to speak after me about kind of some of the importance of hydropower to our resource mix, so that was a good thing that came out of that. But to the question earlier about what's going to fill in those hours when you need something and wind and solar are not available, another challenge in Minnesota is there's a nuclear moratorium. Thankfully, there are 2 nuclear plants in the state that Xcel has been very important to them, that they keep those operating as long as possible. But you can't build any new nuclear energy in the state of Minnesota either. So in terms of what are we doing, one of the things we're doing, again, of course, we did get some amendments as we navigated this bill that will help rural electric cooperative communities navigate this transition in this bill. But another thing that we're doing in the legislative session that just ended and we'll have to continue to do is make the case that you have to have a resource that's carbon-free that can be there all the time, period. And having nuclear off the table doesn't make sense as we continue to try to navigate this environment. And so there's going to be a lot of continued innovation required, for sure. But again, at the moment, saying you need to require innovation, saying that batteries need to get better is not the same as a career engineer in this industry as saying, here's how we're going to do that, and here's what the plan is. And so this pace of transition is certainly concerning for us as we go through this. Another good thing that happened in this bill is there are renewable energy credits that are allowed under the bill, so we're thankful for that. That will help us in the transition. So if you look at the 2024 legislative session, that happened a year ago. What happened just now that wrapped up a week ago? It was a very active session. I say biennium, there are 10,000 bills in the biennium because the way the legislature works is they're actually 2-year sessions, so we just wrapped up a 2-year session about a week ago. Large volume of bills, but generally a lower volume of major things that the legislature worked on and got across the finish line than last year. Even though it's a 3-party, Senate, House, and Governor all Democrat at this point. It's also true that it's very closely divided government in St. Paul because the Senate and the House are very closely divided. In fact, the Senate's only a one-vote majority, and there was a problem in the Senate about a month before that sort of made the Senate and the whole legislature kind of from that time forward get even more difficult to navigate, and in the final hours of the legislature really descended into chaos. So a lot of what they were trying to achieve in terms of big picture items did not get achieved. They really focused on an Uber and Lyft bill that did get achieved in the final hours of the legislative session. But the way the legislature kind of typically works, a lot of the big picture issues come down to the wire. And there were things like the Equal Rights Amendment bill, things like a bonding bill, which you almost always have in the off year when it's not a budget session, which this year was an example of. Sports betting. These were some big picture items that people following the legislature heard about kind of throughout the session that at the end of the session sort of did not make it across the finish line because it just became a very difficult environment because the votes were so closely divided. For us, for co-ops in particular, we had a property tax provision that would protect our members from paying higher property taxes that had been approved in the House and approved in the Senate. It was in the final tax conference committee, didn't have any opposition, but just because of sort of the way that the session ended, it ended up not getting done. So we're hope to be working with the Department of Revenue as actually supports this provision and has indicated they're going to be working with us in the meantime to try to protect our ratepayers from those consequences, and we'll be back to work on that again next year. So one of the things that we didn't want to see happen that we were concerned about this year is a governance bill. Each co-op welcomes member owners to their board meetings, but they have their own locally developed process, often in their bylaws about, or maybe in their board policies about how that process works. So there was a governance bill in St. Paul this year that said, here are some statewide mandates about how you have members at your board meetings. That's a concern to rural electric co-ops. I guess it reminds me, I read a few years ago a book by Asamugla and Robinson called Why Nations Fail. And it was a case study, if you look through history at nations over time. Nations do well when they have a broad cross-section of their citizens engaged economically and politically. And I feel like rural electric co-op boards are a shining example of citizens locally wanting to get involved, running for elections among their neighbors, and wanting to get involved in doing the good business and due diligence of governing their rural electric co-ops. So to say we're going to have St. Paul impose mandates on kind of the way those things operate is something that causes fear for us. So here you have your local Tim Thompson coming to St. Paul to help us say, we do good governance. We have we have a genuine. Our rates are more affordable in terms of recent stability than other sectors of the electric grid at this time. We're doing a great job at managing these co-ops locally, and we really don't need statewide mandates in the area of governance. So this was an example of something that we were concerned about that did not pass the session. We are going to do some events over the next 6 months to kind of work with our members on, are there things we can continue to do better in terms of cooperative governance, and in terms of how each co-op handles having member owners at their meeting. Again, something co-ops already do, but are there ways that we can continue to improve? So we'll be focused on that as a statewide at events in the next few months. Permitting reform is something that did get done that we wanted to see done. I'll mention also ECO. There was a question about energy conservation. An important part of the equation, of course. A couple of years ago, the co-ops were leaders in changing the state policy for energy conservation, so it got a new tagline in that process. It's now called ECO. It used to be called SIP. And so we were kind of leaders in bringing better policy to that whole area of energy conservation in the state a few years ago. In this legislative session, there were some important tweaks to that that did get through, so that was good news. Also, permitting reform was a very good, solid bipartisan approach to, as Jim alluded to, we need more infrastructure in order to meet these goals. Again, we are concerned about the pace of the shutdown of existing infrastructure. Believe we should slow down the shutdown process while we make sure that we have enough energy resources available. But we also clearly need to build more infrastructure in order to have electricity continue to be available through this transition. And so good news at the legislature is they did get a permitting reform done on a bipartisan basis that will shave an estimated 9 months off the process to build a new transmission line or a new resource. So there are federal permitting hurdles, as Jim alluded to. There are also state permitting challenges. And of course, the federal stuff is NRECA. We work with them on that to some degree, but at the state level, it was great to see some permitting reform accomplished this year. There was also a question about distributed generation, about solar at homes, or what's also called net metering in terms of a rate basis. This is something we didn't really work on in terms of things we would like to see change this year. We did work on this in terms of things that we were concerned about making this even worse. So we were on defense on this issue last year. But in the future, in terms of the legislation in the state, something that we feel we need to go back to work on is this topic. Jim mentioned that if you have solar at your home, it's probably about twice as expensive as having solar at the co-op or at utility scale, just because of economies of scale, about twice as expensive. So it's not a matter of whether there will be one or the other. There will clearly be more of both. Clearly, there will be more solar at the utility scale and at homes as the industry moves forward. Solar energy, if you look across the country at what's being installed for new generation, everywhere in the country, solar energy outstrips all other forms of energy in terms of new applications for energy being installed. There's going to be more of this everywhere, whether you like it or not. There's going to be a lot more solar, and generally, you know, the sun's a good thing. So we support solar development. Lake Region has a program where they build solar at your home. We're seeing more solar at Great River Energy. We're seeing more solar across co-op in general. But net metering is a 1983 law that requires that the co-op pay about twice as much for solar from your home as they pay for energy from anywhere else. And the impetus for that law, the explicit impetus for that law in 1983 was that a nascent solar industry should be encouraged to develop. I would suggest that that has changed, right? We no longer have a nascent solar energy industry that you need to move for every $100 for every $100 that Lake Region pays to get energy from anywhere else, they would pay $200 to get that from DG facilities because of the net metering law. So those facilities ought to be there, but the transfer of wealth, that extra $100 you have to pay to get it from people's homes, needs to be fixed because that comes from the other members. That's a transfer of wealth because there's nowhere else for the money to come from at Lake Region to pay the bills, but from the members of Lake Region. So if you pay twice as much to get the energy, you're going to move money from the people that don't install solar systems to those that do. And so that's not appropriate policy anymore. In 16 years, every electron sold in this state is going to be green, going to be carbon-free. So that transfer of wealth is no longer good public policy, and that's something that we're going to be working on in the future. Reliability and affordability are the key things that we're concerned about during these fast-paced changes. We need to slow down the shutdown of existing plants as much as we can to make sure that the grid stays reliable. NERC, Jim mentioned the North American Electric Reliability Council. When I was growing up in the industry, if I needed to go to sleep well, I would reach for my latest NERC report, and it would say everything's fine. What could go wrong? And they're not good bedtime reading anymore. Everything's fine as long as the load doesn't go up. you know? And, but we are more concerned about navigating these challenges in heavy load periods. And so, you know, we are going to do everything we can to stay on top of that and navigate this change successfully. Great River Energy is going to give you more insight about how that, you know, we're relatively well equipped as co-ops to navigate that. We were on that road before these changes, but we're going to also have to continue to stay engaged and ask for your help in working with us on these issues as we go forward. So thank you.
Thank you, Derek. We're going to keep things moving along here. Our next presenter is Zach Ruzicki. Zach's the Director of Resource Planning at Great River Energy, and he's going to give you a little bit of an overview of Great River Energy's energy portfolio and how that's evolving in time. And so please welcome Zach Ruzicki.
Thanks, Jeff. Good morning, everybody. I got to be careful of this podium now. I know it's exploding. So I want to talk today a little bit about our portfolio, what we're doing, why we're doing it, and really elaborate. And I was grateful for Jim's comments at the beginning of today because it really previews what I'm going to be discussing, which is enormous uncertainty, change in our industry, and how that affects GRE and our member cooperatives. Right now, you know, we're experiencing a ton of change. It's uncertainty, it's change, there's some concern. We have regulations at the federal level, we have state requirements, changes to the energy markets and how we do business as a utility in the MISO market. We've got load growth, electrification, we've heard about that today, data centers. So there's a lot, right? And I didn't fit it into my presentation, but I've always wanted to find an excuse to use that Star Wars picture of the trash compactor, right? You know, we're getting squeezed on both sides with tightening energy supply, regulations, with load growth, and really needing to do more with less. And, you know, high level here, we're in a really good position as a generation and transmission cooperative to do that. We've been planning a portfolio that's very well constructed to adapt to this future that we find ourselves in, to be nimble, and that's something that's been intentional over the last 15 to 20 years. Our board and our membership have been very forward-looking in thinking about how we put our portfolio together as a cooperative, what we do. Past, present, and future. You know, we wanted to talk a little bit about what the industry has been, what it is today, and what we think it's going to be in the future. Our group at GRE in power supply, in resource planning, is strategy-based. We think about the next 5, 10, 15 years and further. And how do we position our cooperative today to be competitive and to be successful for our membership and for you as we move into the future? In the past, we had a lot of historic investments in the bulk power system, the transmission backbone, building out coal plants, gas plants, nuclear facilities. This was in the 1950s, 60s, 70s. We had a lot of load growth as well, right? This was a period of time where even up until the recession in 2008, we were seeing 3 to 5% of annual load growth per year, and that was high. Today, we see a different power industry. We see one that has a significant amount of regulations. We see a power sector that's being moved away from gas and coal towards a more variable generation future, more renewables. We see pretty minimal load growth, and you know that's a little different than what you've heard today so far. But for the last 10 years, we've really been seeing about 1% load growth per year, and so that's not much, and that's a big difference from the 3 to 5% that we saw. Transmission expansion is underway today. We know that we need more transmission to build out the grid to serve load. You'll hear from Priti Patel from GRE on this later. But in the future, you know, the reason that I have these 3 quotes up here, Moore's Law, Gilder's Law, Wess's Law, these are technical transition principles about processing power, about network bandwidth, about cost of energy storage. This illustrates the pace of change, right? The pace of change is not linear. The pace of change is exponential. And we're in an industry where we're making multi-decadal investments, where we're investing in a power plant for 30 years, where we're looking at load growth, where we're projecting out what's happening. We're an industry that's not used to the type of growth that we could be facing in the future. We're talking about growth that's based on a really a new industrial revolution. You know, these are the different industrial revolutions that we've seen in this country. We've seen in the 1700s, the 1800s, the 1900s, and now. We saw mechanical production, railroad, steam power in the 1700s, mass production, electrical power assembly line in the 1870s. 1969, 1970s, we saw the automated production of electronics and computers, and into the early 2000s, you know, we went from the Nokia green screen cell phones to an iPad in about 8 years, right? Next, we see artificial intelligence, we see data centers. You know, when Jim said that, I was really glad that he framed it up for me, because I'm sure everybody in this room has heard of AI. You know, you've heard about it, you've read about it, you've seen it on the news, but what does it really mean? And what does it do to us and how we have to think about a power system? It creates a lot of changes, and I'll talk about that later in my presentation. Thinking about the challenges that I framed up, one of which that Derek spoke about is the carbon-free standard. It's something that, speaking from our perspective in Great River Energy, we're well equipped to deal with. Not only do we have a lower standard in 2030, that's one that we can easily meet. 90% in 2035, we feel good about meeting that as well. We recently filed an integrated resource plan with the Minnesota Public Utilities Commission that illustrates that we're going to be pretty darn close to that 90% in 2035. Now, 100% by 2040, that's challenging, right? That becomes a little bit more difficult, but it's not impossible. You know, there are a number of things in the legislation itself that allows us to continue operating things like our gas units. We can retire renewable energy certificates and continue to run our natural gas combustion turbines. You heard about the importance this morning from Jim Matheson about the ability to meet load when it's there. Well, I'll talk later about our fleet of resources. We have a substantial amount of natural gas combustion turbines that are there to meet load when they're needed. We can still run those under the carbon-free standard as written today, as long as we retire renewable energy certificates to offset the generation amounts that they run for. This is our position. You know, this is a waterfall chart that illustrates what we expect our energy generation to be in the next 15 years. And as I spoke about earlier, we're well positioned with minimal actions today. We have been taking actions, forward-looking actions, and actions that were, frankly, ahead of their time and not necessary at that moment to meet a future in which we knew we were going to be living in. Right, so our portfolio, you can see we have a substantial amount of renewable energy that's growing. Our base load, hydro will still be there. Our gas and oil fleet will still be there. Now, keep in mind, this is energy production, right? So our gas units don't run much. They're combustion turbines. They run 2 to 3% of the hours of the year, but they run when the system most needs them. I'll talk about that a little bit later, but this illustrates to you the transition that our portfolio is going through right now, and how we're still going to be providing reliable, cost-effective, and sustainable power. And sustainable here means a couple of things, right? You may be thinking sustainability is green, it's recycling. We think about sustainable also in the ability to continue operating into the future. Like, how resilient is your portfolio, not only to reliability issues on the electrical system, but how resilient is your portfolio to regulatory impacts, to policy changes, right? We want to provide a portfolio for our members that is insulated from potential changes that could be forced on us from the federal government, the state government, and we've been doing a really good job of that in the last 15 years. I just spoke about this, policy risk mitigation. That's one of our driving concerns, right? We've done a number of things to go out and procure wind resources ahead of when we needed them. And we did that at an extraordinarily low cost. We've seen the price of wind resources go up by a factor of 2 in the last 3 years. So wind that was in the market that was $20 a megawatt hour is now $55 a megawatt hour, $60 a megawatt hour in some cases. So we've seen potentially a tripling of the cost of renewables. We went out and started purchasing renewable assets, wind energy, in 2018 to 2021, before we saw a substantial amount of these cost increases. Now, we're still impacted by these cost increases, but we procured a lot of wind before we needed to at very advantageous prices to our members. We've also expanded the amount of renewables that our members can provide themselves. expanding our renewable member resource options from 5% to 10%. But this is a really challenging environment, and I think it underscores the importance of what we have done early. Permitting is hard. Supply chain challenges, inflationary pressures, everything is really converging right now to make this transition to a more renewable economy more expensive. And thankfully, our members are insulated from that largely due to our earlier actions. This is something that Jim had mentioned as well, and I'm glad he did because it's really important. And it underscores the importance of insulating policy risk, insulating our members from policy risk. The end of last month, the EPA signed 4 final rules. Those rules represent changes to air, water, waste, and climate rules. It was an extraordinarily aggressive package of rules that the EPA put forward. Those rules did a number of things. Most namely, and I think most impactful as we are talking about this today, was the impact to baseload generation. 2032 was the year in which we basically see a drop-dead date for coal units and other large energy generating units, or EGUs. This EPA 111 is the rule, creates a very narrow view of the future in how you can create and supply baseload power to the system. So unless you're a coal unit that has a full carbon capture and sequestration system attached to it that's reducing 90% of your CO2 emissions, you can no longer operate. And that's a very expensive proposition. Those carbon capture sequestration systems are substantially expensive. There are also a number of rules on new natural gas units. The same rules apply for new natural gas combined cycle units. So combined cycle units are different than what we have. We have combustion turbines, they don't run very much. Combined cycle units are kind of, like coal light, right? They're running 60 to 80%. They are providing baseload power. There have been a number of combined cycle unit refires in Minnesota. I think Xcel Energy has retrofitted a couple of coal plants to run on gas. But again, high level here, it's rule changes that are really limiting the ability of electric utilities to build infrastructure to serve load on a baseload scale. Now, you heard about our plan and what we've done. We divested a number of our coal units. We sold our largest coal unit in 2021. We still take energy and capacity off of that unit for the next 7 years. So we're getting the benefits of that asset in the market without the commensurate risk. We've also retired a number of coal units as well and exited coal contracts early. Those decisions were really hard. And in some cases, they increased costs for a couple of years. But if we take a long view of what we're doing and how we're trying to provide power and a portfolio to our members over the next 20, 30 years, this is what our decarbonization plan looks like. And it's very aggressive, but it's one that we've managed to do without substantial rate impacts. You may see this and say, oh, wow, it must be really expensive. And it is if you were to do it today, right? But what we've been doing is slow incremental changes over the last 15 years. Our rates are 20% below the weighted regional average electricity rates. And we have fundamentally a different incentive. As a cooperative, I'll talk a little bit about this later, but as a cooperative, we don't have the same incentives that the investor-owned utilities in the state have, the Xcel Energy's, Minnesota Powers. They have an incentive to build more because that adds to their rate base. They get a higher guaranteed rate of return on that investment, and that value goes to their shareholders, right? We don't have shareholders, we have members. Any excess that we generate every year on a revenue basis, we return to our members. Our portfolio today is very well built for this. Those EPA rules that I just spoke about, they don't have an impact today on our gas units. Our capacity position the backbone is provided by those gas units. We have 1,400 megawatts of natural gas combustion turbines. I just spoke about selling that large coal unit. We sold it to Rainbow Energy Marketing Corporation. We're taking a power purchase agreement from Rainbow for capacity and for energy for the next 7 years. We also have 200 megawatts of capacity for Manitoba Hydro. On the energy side, most of our energy is supplied by wind now. Right? We have 1,800 megawatts of wind that's under development right now. We expect to have even more after 2027 and 2028. And then the member resources. I spoke a little bit about our member renewable resources earlier. That's something that we work with our members on as they wish to develop resources. We can facilitate requests for proposal, we can facilitate conversations with developers, but we want to empower our members to develop renewables as they see fit and as they desire. We also have an extraordinarily strong demand-side management system, one of the largest and best demand response portfolios in the country, to clip those peaks. There was a question earlier about what are we doing on the demand side. GRE does a lot. All right, so our portfolio is holistic. We think about it from the generation, the transmission, the distribution, and the load side with our members. This is MISO, and this is just another change, right? This whole presentation is about changes and doing more with less. MISO is the energy market that we do business in. MISO has made a number of changes over the last several years directly in response to some of the reliability concerns that we hear about, right? We've heard about reliability concerns today. There have been changes to reflect the unavailability of variable generating resources in different seasons. Give one example, solar energy. Solar energy for a while was great in MISO because MISO was only evaluating the accreditation or the value that a resource gets in the market based on availability in the summer. Right? So MISO used to only look at reliability in the summer season because that was the peak in MISO. So they said, you know, whatever a resource is able to do on a hot afternoon in August, that's how we're going to give you credit for what that resource gives you in the market. And as a utility in MISO, we have to maintain what's called a planning reserve margin requirement. So we have to carry a certain number of resources, and each resource that we buy, if it's a wind contract, solar, gas plant, it contributes to our margin. The solar used to get 50% accreditation. So if you go out and you buy a 100 megawatt solar contract or you build a plant, you're going to get 50 megawatts of capacity for that. So you get about half credit. MISO transitioned to a seasonal construct in which now they're evaluating reliability spring, summer, fall, and winter. Solar now is proposed to get less than 5% capacity accreditation 3 out of the 4 seasons of the year. So if you're a utility that was planning on 1,000 megawatts of solar to give you 500 megawatts of capacity value in MISO 5 years ago, that 1,000 megawatts of solar is only going to be giving you probably 10 megawatts in the winter, maybe 15 megawatts in the fall and the spring. So it's a big change, right? Wind is also impacted, but not as significantly. And in some seasons, winter capacity is actually increasing. So what does this mean? This means that utilities that were planning to transition away from coal, away from gas to more renewable energy needs to now build a lot more and spend a lot more and recover a lot more through rates to do that. Right, so we have EPA regulations. We have growing load, and now we have renewables that get less credit than they have before. Right, it's not a fun story. It's kind of a rainy parade, but we're in a really strong position due to our gas units, due to our wind-heavy portfolio. If we're a utility that was planning for a lot of solar, it might change our plans, but that's not something that we have in our resource plan right now. What does the future hold? Load growth uncertainty. We've got electric vehicles, data center loads, technological advancements in generation, new battery technologies. Form Energy is a company that we're working with. I'll speak about that in a minute. But small modular reactor technology too. Different types of technologies that need to be able to be developed and do what we have on the grid today with coal and with gas. So we're really at an inflection point in change for both the power supply, generation, and load sides. Electric vehicles. I know we have a speaker on electric vehicles. I want to speak briefly about electric vehicles and data centers because they're two things that might shift the equation for us a little bit. EVs, we have seen a fairly quick adoption rate. That adoption rate seems to be plateauing a little bit in the most recent data that we saw for 2023 and 2024. A lot of those sales were from Tesla. 2024 forecasts are 12.4% market share, and we have seen some of those projections declining. Perhaps we're reaching a saturation rate. Understandably, there's some slowing in the economy today with less purchasing power, higher interest rates. And then in this part of the country, we've seen challenges with increased electric vehicle adoption based on cold weather and charging. So we do expect to see increases in electric vehicles. Our plan today, it's not a game changer, right? It's certainly a complexity, and it changes our load forecasting, but it's not something that's going to turn the game on its head. It's going to more likely to change the load curve and the timing of those required power demands than anything else. Now, data centers, that is a game changer, right? You've heard about artificial intelligence, AI. We've been working with data centers for years, right? For cloud-based software, for back end of the internet capability, but not for AI. And AI is fundamentally different. It requires exponentially more processing power than other data centers do. So as we see this arms race between Apple, Google, Microsoft, Meta, all these companies are in an arms race right now to build as much as they can, as quickly as they can, and before their competitors do, right? The sites are also very specific. They have a very specific set of things that they need. They need land, they need proximity to urban centers, airports, they need water supply, they need fiber, and they need affordable rates. Minnesota checks a lot of those boxes, if not all of them. This is probably one of the most appetizing areas to site these data centers in the country. And you heard Jim talk a little bit about where these data centers are going to go. They're not going to go outside the U.S. All these U.S.-based companies, Google, Microsoft, Meta, they want this infrastructure in the country for cybersecurity reasons, right? When we were speaking with companies recently, we've talked to one who wants to build 80,000 megawatts of new data centers in the next 10 years. That's just one company. That's more demand than the entire eastern interconnect, the eastern seaboard of the U.S., right? You increase that by a factor of 3, by a factor of 4. You're talking about doubling or more the total energy consumption in the U.S. in the next 10 years. Now, how are you going to serve that, right? That's the problem and the pace of change that we're facing, right? The question that we need to ask and answer, is this a truly transformative change to the power industry? Is this something that's like a cell phone level change? Or is this something that we just adapt to and that we tell them, hey, we can't serve you? Or is this something where they say, we're going in the ground here, you're going to serve us, figure it out? Right? We need to understand, what does this transition look like? But this transition is happening incredibly fast, right? Where in this development curve are we right now? You know, is it going to plateau? Are we going to see continued growth? And then how do we serve it, right? Does this break the mold that we have been operating within for the last 50 years as an industry? So, you know, there are a lot of questions to answer, but as a cooperative, we have a benefit, right? Our structure as a member-owned and board-governed utility gives us an advantage compared to rate-regulated utilities in both the pace and the autonomy that we have to design rate systems and power supply to serve these loads and to adapt to changes that we're seeing in the regulatory system, right? It doesn't circumvent our ability to avoid the PUC or the Public Utilities Commission to build a new asset. But, and we would still need to go to the PUC if we wanted to build a new gas plant or a nuclear reactor or a new battery. But the approval coming from our board will definitely be advantageous as to going through the regulatory process with the PUC and the structural changes that we have there. So we've got a number of options in front of us, right? We've got great relationships with small modular reactor companies. We work with TerraPower, with NewScale, with X-Energy, GE Westinghouse. On the storage side, we have a really novel project right now. It's a Form Energy long-duration storage battery. It's in Cambridge, Minnesota. Jim Matheson talked about the need for long-duration storage. Usually storage is about 4 hours. This battery that we're working on developing with Form is 100 hours. Right, so that does help us with respect to reliability, being able to take that renewable energy, store it when you don't need it, or just store energy from the grid and dispatch it over 100 hours when you have 2 or 3 days when wind and solar aren't available. So we have a significant amount of change in our portfolio, and we're one of the largest generation transmission cooperatives in the country. We're also aggressively utilizing MISO products like surplus interconnection. Right? Our size allows us to be creative and to drive change. One of these things that we do is we use our previously existing resources to interconnect into for wind resources. And that's very valuable, being able to circumvent the MISO process and bring wind directly to the market more quickly. Tim asked me to speak quickly about this, and I will move through it very quickly because Jim also talked about it. But new era, right? Very transformative source of change here. $9.7 billion appropriation. GRE is very fortunate in that we've been invited to proceed to the next stage of the competition. So we're actively working with the USDA Rural Utilities Service Office to try to bring a substantial amount of federal dollars to Minnesota and to our membership to offset the cost of existing and new renewable energy development. So this is something that is going to provide a ton of value to the membership, and we're really excited about that. So what to take away from today, our portfolio, our plan, the plan that we've built with our members is very competitive. It's a carbon-free resource mix that we're tracking for compliance with the renewable energy standard, with the carbon-free standard. We're avoiding a substantial, if not total, amount of policy risk from the federal government's most recently published regulations. And our 2035 goal for the carbon-free standard looks very attainable, right? Our portfolio is low cost, it's low risk, and that's really important. We want to make sure that we're providing affordability, but we're still providing reliability. As a cooperative, we have a collective strength. Right? We have a very diverse membership. We have a very innovative membership. Our power supply is top-notch, and we're really proud of that. Our transmission system that we've built is reliable, and we have significant access to capital and energy markets. So we're in a great position. We're excited about the future. It's challenging, but it's one that we're looking forward to addressing with our membership. I think that's all I have.
Thank you, Zach. Again, we're going to hold questions until after our presenters have all completed their presentation. So keep writing them down or think of those as you're thinking and hearing this information. Our next presenter is going to dive a bit deeper into one of the resources, as Zach mentioned, hydropower. Jim Horan is the Executive Director of the Midwest Electric Consumers Association. And the Midwest is a customer group of 314 municipal and cooperative utilities from 9 upper Great Plains and western states. Please welcome Jim.
Good morning, everybody. So I'm going to dive in to, as Jeff mentioned, a specific generation resource. I'm going to give you a little bit of background on Midwest and how I fit into this. This is a little bit of old home week for me. I worked for Derek Moe at the Statewide Association for a few years, worked for Jim Matheson at NRECA for a few years, and now work at what, as Jeff mentioned, is called the Customer Group. So we focus on, or I focus on, federal hydropower. So I'll talk about hydropower generally, but my focus, and the focus, particularly for Lake Region, because Lake Region gets a portion of its power supply from federal hydropower, is what's called the Pick-Sloan Plan and the largely main stem hydropower systems on the Missouri. So the Missouri Basin is pictured here. It obviously extends a little further than that. It extends into Minnesota, so western Minnesota. Cooperatives and municipals have an allocation of federal hydropower. We extend over to Montana, down to Colorado as well. Again, these are main stem systems. Most of these were built starting in the 30s up to the 70s, late 70s, and are huge generation systems. And that's how we kind of play into it. So 314 co-ops and munis in 9 states that get access to this. I'm going to try to keep this somewhat high level. Happy to answer questions on anything. We have some very active Midwest members in the room, have some WAPA staff, Western Area Power Administration staff in the room as well. And so some good assets and folks we can talk to as well. So hydropower, again, a tremendous resource, a baseload resource. Really, we talked about baseload resources. We've also talked about batteries. Hydropower, particularly pump storage, but hydropower that's impounded behind reservoirs, large reservoirs, is still the largest battery source in the country for power supply. And we saw this particularly in our footprint during Winter Storm Uri, where WAPA was able to put another 5,000 megawatts into the system at a critical peak moment to generate power when it was needed. And they could do that because there was water behind the reservoirs to do that. They could push it through at a certain amount of time. Hydropower also offers, in addition to being a baseload resource, a lot of ancillary benefits. So black start capabilities in the event of a coal or nuclear plant going down. Hydropower, because it's always spinning, always available, is able to restart that system. And so we see a lot of benefit from that. We've also seen increasingly in the last 10 years, 5 years in particular, hydropower backing up non-dispatchable resources, wind and solar, and particularly wind. Hydropower being able to follow wind supply and being there when it's needed. So hydropower on the Missouri, our system on the Missouri provides power 24/7, 365. We obviously have some seasonal fluctuations with water supply, but because we're trying to balance the river for a lot of other authorized users, but it's always there and it's always available. And I think we're going to continue to see hydropower, the baseload hydropower resource, as a greater asset as we move into markets, both here in MISO and in an SPP in the West. We'll see this baseload resource becoming more valuable. Midwest, how we engage on this, and Lake Region's a member, so your members, through Midwest or through Lake Region, we get involved on the lobbying side, so 35 members of Congress in the 9 states. Regulatory advocacy, I work closely with WAPA, Western Area Power Administration, which is the PMA, the Power Marketing Administration for this region. There's a PMA for generally every part of the country. The Tennessee Valley Authority, think about it that way. Bonneville Power Administration in the Northwest. I'll talk about the Northwest. So we work a lot with the PMAs, with Western Area Power Administration, and with also what we call the generating agencies. So the Corps of Engineers, they operate largely the main stem, and then the Bureau of Reclamation runs some off of the tributaries in our footprint. And then legal representation as well. We get involved in rate processes. We are essentially a watchdog group for Western Area Power Administration, for the Bureau of Reclamation, and for the Corps of Engineers. And so we get involved in their formal rate processes, in transmission siting, in endangered species issues, and I'll spend some more time on ESA issues as well. So areas that I'm going to focus on today, and again, I'm going to kind of move through at a higher level, and I'm happy to answer questions when we get to that point of the program. Start out with WAPA rate process. So to give you a little bit of background, when these systems were built, when the main stem systems were built, the idea of Congress was to keep the value within the basin and to keep the value with as close to the population, to the people as possible. So cooperatives, municipals had access to federal hydropower. Investor-owned utilities, Xcel, did not have access to federal hydropower. So contracts were established with consumer-owned utilities, co-ops, and munis. You got a portion of that based on historic load. Those were appropriated largely in the 70s, looking at 60s numbers. WAPA sets rates, working with its generating agencies, at the lowest possible cost, following best business practices or sound business practices. So as a watchdog, we're always making sure that WAPA's rates are as low as they possibly can be. And right now, WAPA power, hydropower, is about 63% of market cost. So it's a low-cost, renewable baseload power, and one that's important to anyone who has it in their system, as a part of their system. We are seeing another rate increase coming from WAPA. We haven't talked a lot this morning about the utility cost increases we've seen, not only inflationary pressures and cost of staff, but we've also seen an increased cost of equipment and the time frame it takes to get that. So substations, transformers, anything that we're building or rebuilding is taking longer and costing more than it used to. So that's what's driving the rate increase with WAPA. We'll see another rate process that'll start here in the next couple of weeks, go through the end of the year, and we'll see a new rate from WAPA in 2025. Purchase power and wheeling. I mentioned every utility that's a customer, every co-op and community that's a customer of WAPA has a long-term contract. And so WAPA has to meet those contractual obligations regardless of seasonal differences in water supply and water generation or power generation, and regardless of drought conditions. And so WAPA uses purchase power and wheeling to meet those needs, to meet that requirement in a course of a year. This is also a good place to tie in transmission. And Tim Thompson, when he started out, had a headline about WAPA and DOE spending $1.3 billion, or announcing $1.3 billion in spending for transmission strengthening. So grid enhancing technologies, things that get more out of the transmission system that we already have. WAPA is unique in that it spans 15 states. We're in 9 of those, but it spans 15 states. It is one of the largest, if not the largest, transmission-owning entities in the country. And so it also sits between, where we are, in between the east and west interconnects of the country. So it has the ability to connect the eastern United States and the western United States in a way that very few utilities and entities can. And so WAPA gets pulled in, I think, understandably, into a lot of these transmission discussions. So focus has been, and we'll talk a little bit about the federal funding side of it, has been funding dollars for transmission hardening, for grid enhancing technologies. WAPA also has what's called the Transmission Infrastructure Program, or TIP. And TIP is a $3.5 billion loan program that is being used to, and has been around for 15 years now, 16 years now, is being used to loan and fund transmission development within the WAPA footprint. It has to have a terminus within the WAPA footprint. And we'll see a little bit more, I think, focus on transmission build-out and the role of WAPA and our utilities, not only because of the federal funding dollars that are out there and the permitting challenges that are out there, but because Congress has the authority now, and DOE is starting to work through this, for national interest electric transmission corridors, or NITSEs. So this allows the federal government, along with FERC, to designate areas of transmission build-out that are needed to benefit the region or the country, and essentially make sure those get approved. It's been mentioned earlier that transmission building in the United States, Jim Mathis mentioned it, is at least a 10-year planning horizon. That might be a little optimistic. We've seen some stuff in the Midwest that's been well over 10 years to build. And so how do we build new transmission? How do we rebuild or reconductor existing transmission? And how do we do more with what we have? And we need to build more transmission because of everything you've heard before this, for the energy needs that are coming in the country. And so WAPA, Western Area Power Administration, and you as customers are going to be a big part into that. Hydropower threats. I'm going to touch on 3. One in particular, probably you've noticed in the news over the last couple of months, year, the Lower Snake River dams, the Columbia River system in the Northwest. This is a federal program, federal system. These dams are run by the Corps and Corps of Engineers and Bureau of Reclamation. There has been an effort amongst tribal governments and 2 states, Oregon and Washington, to remove the dams on the Lower Snake. The purpose of removing the dams on the Lower Snake is to recover salmon species on that river. The Lower Snake River Dam discussion is a challenging one because, again, we're removing baseload generation, an incredible amount of baseload generation. And there's also other ancillary benefits of dams on this system, on any system. In the Northwest, it's irrigation, it's municipal water supply, it's navigation, be able to move grain and farm goods to market, so all those other benefits on the Lower Snake River. So we've watched this issue quite a bit, and there has been a systematic effort to kind of undermine the hydropower system in the Northwest. And so it's something we watch here. We are fortunate in the Missouri River Basin to not see calls to remove dams. The Missouri River dams were first and foremost constructed for flood control. And all you have to do is look back to 2019 and see the impact that dams had in stopping flooding in the lower basin. In fact, the Corps of Engineers literally stopped the Missouri River for almost a week during 2019 and reduced flooding in the lower river. So we haven't seen the call to remove those, but we still see this call to systematically undermine the value of hydropower. Glen Canyon on the lower Colorado, you have 2 reservoirs, reclamation reservoirs, Glen Canyon and then Hoover. And Glen Canyon almost reached what's called minimum power pool a couple of years ago. They had a couple of good winters, and so water's been back up in Glen Canyon, but there has been a call almost since Glen Canyon was built to remove Glen Canyon. And so it's being pushed by environmental groups who want it out because of recovering the canyon, fish and wildlife issues. They have about 5 endangered species that they're working with on Glen Canyon. And then irrigation groups in California have argued that they should remove Glen Canyon and have just one reservoir on the lower Colorado to reduce evaporation. So one reservoir versus two. So we're seeing a call for that. And then externality costs, we're increasingly seeing this call by some environmental groups who are trying to artificially raise the cost of hydropower. So the argument that's being made is organic material in rivers slows down and stops in reservoirs. It rots in those reservoirs and releases methane. And that methane released from the reservoir should be considered a greenhouse gas or should be considered a carbon emission, and we should artificially increase the cost of hydropower because of that organic material. So we watch this one very carefully because, again, it's not, the science is a little iffy on that one, and it artificially raises the cost of a baseload renewable resource. So something we watch very carefully. Dam safety modification, excuse me. Most of these projects, as I mentioned, were built 60, 70 years ago. Most of them have been invested in because of your dollars through your rates over those 70 years and are doing incredibly well. That said, there are times that things were built 70 years ago that we might want to build differently today. One of those, and this, what's pictured here, is the Garrison Spillway in North Dakota. The Garrison Spillway was used one time in 2011 and it started to fail. And so the Corps has highlighted the Garrison Spillway as one of the ones that needs to be rebuilt or redesigned, modified first. And so the cost on doing this right now is $1.9 billion with a B. Adjusted for inflation, that's about the cost of the entire project when they built the Garrison project back in the 50s. But the spillway is going to have to be redone. Power customers are going to have to pick up a portion of that cost. And we've been fighting with the Corps in Congress over the amount of that cost. But I bring this up to highlight that these projects, while we have continued to invest in them over decades, are going to need some significant investment in the future. They were built at the time with about a 100-year lifespan. We are 50, 60, 70 or more years into that, and so we're going to have some of those discussions. We deal with that. You can see it in the center thing here with sedimentation on the Missouri. Gavin's Point in South Dakota will end up being unable to produce power sometime in the 2050s because of sedimentation, sediment building behind in the reservoir behind the dam. So we work with groups to try to figure out how to deal with sedimentation issues. And Gavin's is just one of them. Every Missouri main stem dam is going to have, every dam is going to have issues with sedimentation over time. Endangered species on the Missouri, we have two main endangered species. We have 50 threatened species. The two that we focus on are pallid sturgeon, that top fish, and the piping plover. The pallid sturgeon is like most sturgeon. It has a long lifespan, 60, 70 years, and so we're decades into recovery, but we have decades and decades more to fully recover this species. And we've done well with this. It actually does fairly well with the reservoirs, but there's still breeding issues in recovering that species that we focus on. And then water clarity issues, I won't spend any time on that, but it's a Colorado-specific issue, but clarity and water quality, environmental issues are huge factors into keeping hydropower costs affordable. So with that, happy to answer questions when we go to the end of this. My contact is up here, and happy to answer questions during our discussion later. Thank you.
Thank you, Jim. All right, our next presentation is going to be from Priti Patel. Priti is joining us virtually, and Priti is the Vice President and Chief Transmission Officer for Great River Energy. With over 25 years of electric utility experience, Priti currently oversees all aspects of the transmission business at Great River Energy, including investment strategy, planning, permitting, construction, maintenance, engineering, project management, as well as field services and system operations. Priti, are you there?
I am. Can you hear me, Jeff?
Yes, we can. Welcome.
Great.
And we can see you
Well,
too.
thank you. Thanks for the nice introduction, and good morning, everyone. I want to thank Tim and Lake Region Electric Cooperative for inviting me again to be a part of this year's forum. I appreciate being a part of the dialogue because, like everyone before me has said, there is so much underway in our state and in our region and nationally, and I want to thank Dylan in advance for advancing my slides. We can go to the next slide. So I think at last year's Energy Forum, I talked about how GRE has been putting a lot of energy into understanding what it's going to take from a transmission perspective to enable the fleet transition that's taking place. And that's not just across our state. We're working with utilities to meet the carbon-free standard of 2040 that Minnesota passed, but it's also the broader region that we have to plan for, and building transmission as a strategic solution to some of the challenges we face as we see the transition of our generation and our region, make sure we can continue to deliver reliable and affordable service. Because when it comes to transmission, it's not just needed for reliability. It's needed to make sure that we can reduce the cost of energy that's delivered to our member customers, and it makes sure that we can deliver low-cost generation across the grid at the time that customers need it. So that it is very critical from both a reliability and affordability perspective. And since we last met, there's been a lot of progress that's happened, but there's still, frankly, a lot to do. And we have been working with our fellow utilities, our members, policymakers, as you heard Derek Moe talk about, to see how we can move things more quickly. And while the pace has been at a pretty fast clip, it's still not fast enough. Next, please. So this slide just really sums up, I think, what you heard from many speakers this morning, how we are in such a complete and holistic evolution. We know the generation mix is changing. Coal's been a backbone of our power supply since the 60s. It's retiring. 50% of the country's coal plants are expected to retire by 2030. In that same time frame, coal-fired power is expected to retire in this state. So while we're all aware of this change, it's like everyone has said so far, it's the pace and the clip of this change that's been staggering for many of us. It's very fast for an industry that's capital intensive and provides the type of critical services we provide. At the same time, how we're using electricity is changing. So electrification isn't a what if, it's a when. And as you heard Jim Matheson talk about this morning, NERC reported that they expect an end to flat load growth, but that's not necessarily, it's not necessarily driven by traditional means. It's because we're seeing these large load increases like data centers come into play in our state. So we're seeing demand forecasts skyrocketing, and that's putting a lot of pressure on our sector. We're seeing upwards of 1,000 megawatts at a single location in Minnesota being proposed. And certainly we have extreme weather events that make us have to tend to age and condition a little bit faster in a pretty methodical way. And so, how do we continue to maintain reliability as our dependency on wind and solar is growing and our demand for power isn't just greater, but it's got to be, we've got to deal with the fact that it's going to be more dynamic. And one of the primary means is transmission, because that is a way that we can, it becomes a central piece of our energy system, and making sure that we maintain and improve the transmission that we have and build new transmission is really a huge part of our focus now. You'll see that transmission starts stitching together what's needed to make sure that we can maintain the type of reliability that members and customers up here in Minnesota have been used to for such a long time. Next. And let's talk about that a little bit. So we often hear reliability, people talk about it as keeping the lights on, right? But the role of transmission in keeping the lights on is really evolving, and it's starting to expand. So because of that, we have continued that focus on expanding the grid along with the transition that's happening and making significant investments in the grid to enable low-cost energy to continue to be delivered to customers when they need it. So for decades, if you look at the lower left, for decades upon decades, transmission was designed to be load serving. And what that means is it was designed to really transport energy from generation to where it was needed. And historically, we had large, centrally located generation, so sizing transmission was a pretty simple task, right? We made sure the system could handle the hottest summer day, and we were pretty confident it could handle all the days in between. And in the early 2000s, we start seeing this shift from centrally located power plants to more geographically dispersed renewables. So the role of transmission is now to maintain reliability started evolving. We began designing transmission to be able to interconnect and collect renewable generation. And that was really the predominant driver for the last big build out that many of you probably remember in Minnesota in the 2010s, the CapEx projects, and some of the other MISO multi-value projects. So right now, we're at the stage of, we have large dispatchable plants that are retiring. And these plants didn't just provide power to the grid, but because they have large rotating mass, they also helped keep voltages stable. So keeping the lights on requires a constant frequency of the grid, right, at 60 hertz. So as the plants have retired, now the transmission grid is taking its place to maintain stability. And as we look forward, a decarbonized grid is where we have to think of days of complete reliance on weather-dependent resources like wind, solar, as well as looking for the dynamic load patterns that we might encounter from electrification, like EVs. So it's no longer about sizing the grid to handle the hottest summer peak day, but now the grid's got to be sized to handle all hours. And you hear about that from people talking about energy adequacy, right? So we've got to, as we look forward, we have to expect to transfer more power, long distances, and more dynamically. And that's the chapter we're in now in our evolution. And probably not even in the distant future, to maintain reliability of the grid, we will probably need to start having it act more like a dispatchable generator rather than what it's always been, a kind of a historic passive conduit for power. And you'll see more HVDC, flow control, dynamic voltage regulation. That will be a regular and necessary part of the transmission infrastructure equation to make sure we can keep the flexibility we need to keep the lights on. So as we move up the spectrum that you see on the slide, none of the previous roles really go away. We just continue to add to them. And it's the fast pace of change in the industry that we're really feeling. Next, please. So I always like to show this quick snapshot of our system over the years. You know, we have built a very robust system of transmission in Minnesota, and we have some in North Dakota. And if you stretched out all of the transmission that we own and maintain, it would go from Minnesota to Rome, Italy. We had somebody calculate that. But that's how much transmission is needed to serve our members. We have over 100 substations, 5,000 miles of transmission lines, 9 service centers to meet the daily needs of our member owners. And the point I really want to make on the slide that gets to a broader point in transmission is that, you know, we're heavily intertwined with transmission systems of 17 other transmission owners inside of the state. So what you see in red is GRE transmission, green is the transmission of others, and you just see how integrated we are. Deeply interconnected with transmission owned by Minnesota Power, Ottertail Power, Xcel Energy, others. You know, an example of this is the fact that Lake Region is served by both GRE and Ottertail Power systems. And so when it comes to reliability, we are quite literally dependent on one another's resilient and reliable systems in order to make sure that we can maintain reliability for one another's customers, right? Next, please. You know, and that point leads to this, which is, you know, when your goal is to develop the right transmission at the right cost and the right time, we can't succeed by working in silos. And so time and time again, our success in planning and building transmission to, you know, our load serving transmission as well as regional transmission, it's actually been achieved through collaborating with our neighbors, our member owners, and other stakeholders. Efficient, cost-effective, optimal transmission can only be achieved through our collaboration with everybody that you see on this, all the entities on this slide. It's just a good reminder of what it looks like for GRE to be successful, create alliances and partnerships so that we can do more than just good. We can do something greater than good, create good policy, create good laws, create trust to move things quicker. Those are all really important things when we think about the pace of change. The relationships we build and the spirit of collaboration to move things quicker is important. So next, please. So let me, and speaking of quicker, I think this lyric really reflects the sentiment that many of us in transmission share every day, that to decarbonize Minnesota by 2040, to make sure that our members continue to have reliability and the delivery of low-cost power, we still have a long way to go, but somehow we have a short time to get. Next. And so when people talk about what it takes to decarbonize, you often hear that expression that the last 10%, I think you heard it even this morning, is really hard to achieve. I agree with that sentiment, but the reality is that each step towards that last 10% has been exponentially more complicated. In fact, MISO here has identified what they call an inflection point in complication, which we are nearing. And what I mean by complexity is the fact that more electronics are needed on the grid to maintain stability. So it's important to remember that as the MISO footprint, which is 15 states and Manitoba in Canada, which we belong to, as it looks to just achieve greater penetration of decarbonization, both the complexity and the magnitude of transmission investments increase exponentially. So last quarter, probably 30% of MISO's energy mix came from carbon-free resources, and that's MISO-wide. In Minnesota, the percentage of the energy mix coming from carbon-free is probably higher, but this shows it from an integrated MISO-wide system perspective. And you'll likely recall from my presentation last year, I talked about how in 2022, MISO had approved its first portfolio of regional transmission projects, right? Tranche 1, you heard Tim say that this morning, the largest build out in history and the most sophisticated transmission planning that's been done so far, frankly, nationally. The portfolio was 18 projects throughout northern and central parts of the MISO footprint, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. But that portfolio is expected to yield 40% decarbonization across MISO, and you see that on the graphic in blue. But this isn't enough, right? That portfolio isn't enough, especially when you've got states that are looking to get to 80 and 100% decarbonization by 2040, like Minnesota, and we have to look at the whole footprint together. So as we're looking to achieve those higher elevated levels of decarb, MISO-wide, beyond 40%, the need for transmission increases exponentially. Next, please. So this is the MISO transmission portfolio I referenced, and I believe I talked about last year as well. This is the tranche that moves us along the path of decarbonization. But what this tranche was really meant to do is address reliability throughout the MISO footprint, because of all the generation retirements and grid issues caused by the retirements. So this is 18 projects across the footprint, the largest simultaneous build out since the original electrification of the country. CapEx 2020, those projects were about $5 billion. This is about 10.3. And the big driver here, is to get on the path toward decarbonization. So it's a 20-year view, but this tranche is about maintaining reliability. These are all high voltage projects, 345 kV. It enables nearly 43 gigawatts of renewables. The economic benefits exceed the cost, and it helps decarbonization in the sense that it maintains reliability in the face of the retirements. And as you can see on the slide, the projects enable approximately 10% more decarbonization from where we are today. So it enables 40% in the next 20 years. And what that means for Minnesota, which is located in Zone 1, which is that grayish area that you see up there, Minnesota, the Dakotas, and western Wisconsin, that just over, it amounts to about over 50% decarb for that zone. So we still have a ways to go. Next slide, please. So GRE has been doing its part. We're involved in 2 projects, and I want to be clear about why we're involved in these projects. We have active investment in these projects for 2 reasons. One, we want to make sure that reliability inside of Minnesota is achieved. And second, we want to earn revenue by investing in projects to bring our member and customer costs down. So the first project that you see is the north-south line, which is in orange, the Northland Reliability Project. It's driven by reliability. This is not a project that's about interconnecting renewables. It is about keeping the lights on and keeping the grid stable and safe. And the primary need for this is we've got to get power to northern and central Minnesota during the most dire, high load times of the year. So this part of the state's already had retirements of large base load plants, and they're projected to have more retirements in the next 10 years. And in northern Minnesota, reliability was really provided by those large coal plants. And so the loss of the plants and the expected losses of these plants will have a huge impact on voltage stability in the north, because you've got to move power from the south to the north, and it's stressing the system that's surrounding it, which is 115 kV and 230 kV transmission. This project helps tie the grid together, the Northland Reliability Project. The next project is Alexandria to Bago. It's that diagonal line that you see on the screen. And that is about adding a second circuit. So these are existing transmission structures, adding a second circuit, and the need for this line has been how heavily constrained the 230 kV system is in the eastern Dakotas and western central Minnesota throughout the year. And the 230 kV system has been playing a pretty important role in transporting energy across a pretty big geographic area of Minnesota to get generation out of the Dakotas and into Minnesota. But this project will support additional renewable development, and it'll help alleviate congestion because it's going to increase the transfer capability between the 2 regions. So right now, Northeast South Dakota has lower LMPs than the Twin City areas, and this project will help equalize those LMPs. So both are in the regulatory process in Minnesota, and we're hoping to get permits by the end of the year. Next, please. You know, I just want to talk a little bit about the approach we've taken as we've developed this, near $1 billion project, the Northland Reliability Project. We're taking an approach that helps position us both now and in the long term too. And that's also based on previous experience we've had on large projects similar to this. But, our goal has been to minimize impact to our communities. That is our long-term objective. It's difficult enough to develop a $1 billion transmission line, but the reality is this is only the start, as I've talked about. We know much more transmission is going to be needed. And so from a relationship perspective, I often get asked, what's the key to developing a $1 billion transmission line? And it's pretty simple. It is people and it's local communities. And as a cooperative, we are servants of our communities. And while we know the project is needed for reliability, we need our communities to buy into it. So we know we have to engage and build relationships and help them be educated and understand what the project is for. And so we've intentionally sent the same 10 people to every meeting for this project since its inception. This team knows all the stakeholders in the communities. They know their names, they know their neighbors and their backgrounds, the concerns. We've had 26 open houses in 7 months on this project, and we've sent the same team. Optionality, we want to do everything in our power so that we don't have to come back to these communities in 5 or 10 years and say, oh, hey, we need additional right-of-way. We're doing our best to optimize our facilities. So looking at sizing and configuration to make sure we can meet future needs 20, 30, 40 years out. We've done this before with the CapEx build-out where we designed transmission lines on structures that were capable of housing a second circuit to carry more power. And we're doing that again with this project, and we plan to do the same approach with other projects. And then in the spirit of resiliency too, of the do it, the same kind of do it right once spirit, we are proactively trying to address resiliency. So our number one threat, weather-related threat, is an ice storm with wind during the winter and derechos in the summer. So currently the risk is highest in southern Minnesota, but it's, our 50-year projection is showing that that risk is starting to creep up north where this line is located. So we're building structures stronger to be able to withstand higher wind speeds and using twisted pair so that it can withstand icing as well. Next, please. So even though we're in the midst of our work on those projects, we're participating in the MISO stakeholder process and developing Tranche 2. That's coming up fairly soon. That first tranche, like I said, was about reliability. This tranche, this portfolio, will be about decarbonization. And it is about taking the footprint, the MISO footprint, from 40% to 60% decarbonization. And we've been actively working on this. They estimate it'll cost between 17 and 23 billion. And it'll be the first time, their first map came out, and it'll be the first time that they use 765 kV in Minnesota. So what you see in green on this map is 765 kV. Right now, they've got a number of east-west paths across the Midwest to really help increase the transfer capability. And really, this design by MISO is to create a superhighway, a new extra high voltage backbone to move power. Now, 765 is not a new technology. It's been used successfully in the US since the 60s. It was pioneered by AEP in Indiana. It is the highest voltage AC transmission in the United States. So when you think of one 765 line, it equals, at about 250 or so miles, 5,000 megawatts of transfer capability. So it's the equivalent of 6 single circuit 345 kV lines. And it is, in our view, the most cost-effective option to move the magnitude of power that we see needing to be moved from the Dakotas through Minnesota, Iowa, Wisconsin, and onward is really the most cost-effective option, because you lessen the land use impacts with 765. You need less right-of-way for 765. So this plan you see is not final. MISO is still considering alternatives, and the transmission owners are debating the voltages, they're debating the projects, but MISO does expect by the end of the year to approve Tranche 2. Next. So there's always a lot of attention on the big stuff that I talked about, the big transmission, like MISO's big portfolio of projects. They make the headline. But at GRE, we are equally, if not more, focused on our lower voltage system and all of our local needs that impact our members the most. The big stuff isn't successful if we can't continue to focus on our lower voltage load serving transmission. Next, please. So just to quickly talk about what we've been working on and focusing on, we have had, we meet regularly with our 27 members, and we create member reliability assessments to make sure we understand what reliability means from our members' perspective. This has been productive. We have done this with Lake Region and many members, and it's important so that we understand what our members' prioritizations are for projects and what their business strategies are, and we can make sure that the transmission is there to meet those strategies. We've been focused on age and condition. We've got over 5,000 miles of transmission that was built in the 60s and 70s, and quite a bit will reach life expectancy of 72 years in the next 20 years, and it needs to be replaced. So we believe that our system is going to get further stressed through distributed generation and electrification, and so we have increased our upgrades from 55 miles of our system per year to 75 miles, so we can stay on top of this issue, on top of everything else that needs to be constructed. And certainly extreme weather events are stressing the system too. So we've got a number of natural hazards that we have to account for, and for that reason we really taken a long view of what the weather events will look like and taking those long views into account today with how we plan and design the system. So our approach is holistic to make sure all transmission, regardless of scale, is beneficial to our members. Next, please. And that leads me to what GRE has been focused on when it comes to serving Lake Region. You know, GRE Transmission serves Lake Region's 30 distribution substations, and over the past 5 years, we've invested nearly $27 million in upgrades and various load projects for load projections in the area. So a large percentage have been associated with the Frazee area projects, substation rebuild, a transformer replacement, a new line, some other upgrades, and largely driven by the Hoot Lake Gen retirement in the area. And in the next 5 years, we plan to invest nearly $35.4 million in Lake Region. Of course, a lot of that going to upgrading and rebuilding aging infrastructure. So we really appreciate the partnership we have with Lake Region and making sure we understand Lake Region's needs and strategies so we can meet our member where they're at. Next, please. And this is my last slide before I wrap up. But, you know, in addition to all of the new construction, the new investments that we have to make, right, in new transmission, we are upgrading and reinvesting in our existing transmission, and that includes what you heard earlier today, grid enhancing technology, right? We've got to optimize the infrastructure that we have, our existing transmission, and get the most out of what we currently own. Now, the problem we're facing is that there are areas of the grid in Minnesota where there's much more generation that wants to get on the system than the system will allow. And so this is preventing low-cost generation from getting delivered to customers. So last year, we decided to pilot grid-enhancing technology called dynamic line rating technology, where we can make better use of the lines that we have. We partnered with Heimdall Power, and they're a grid technology company out of Norway. And they have a sensor technology that you can see on the slide here. It's a round sphere, and they're placed on transmission lines via drone, so you can do it when the line is hot. And these new sensors give us more real-time insights into what actual capacity exists on the transmission line in the moment. And that can help us unlock untapped capacity on the line. And it allows us to send more power down existing transmission lines so we can alleviate traffic jams and we can help take advantage of low-cost power. And so when we did the pilot project on one of our lines, it showed over a 40% increase in capacity on one line that we piloted. So we just announced the largest dynamic line rating project in the country with Heimdall Power. And we're installing 52 of their neurons on 4 of our transmission lines in the state that show us the most congestion. And we're really excited to see what we can learn from that install. We'll have more on that early next year. So the next slide is really my wrap up, and happy to take any questions, but you know, we're making a lot of progress in the area of transmission development and build out. We're trying to keep up with the pace and make sure that reliability and cost are at the forefronts of our minds. So thank you for the time, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Pretty. Will you be able to stay on for the remainder of the event for any Q&A after the last 2 speakers?
Unfortunately, I will not be able to. And my apologies to that.
No, that's okay. Perhaps we can take one question from the audience. We are going to forego the break. I know there's a 10-minute break on the agenda, but we're going to try to push through to the end with our last 2 speakers. But if there is one question that folks have for Pretty, I'd be happy to take that. Yes, sir, right over here. So the question, Pretty, was whether or not, with respect to the dynamic line ratings, is the MISO market presently set up to utilize that technology capability today?
Yeah, that's a great question. So right now what we are doing is we're in the process of making sure that when the data from Heimdall goes into our EMS, that data can then get transferred into MISO. And our understanding is that there is another utility that has successfully done this with MISO. And so we feel confident that when we get to that stage of data delivery, that we'll be able to do it, that they've got the structure in place to be able to take it on.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Pretty. Appreciate it. Thank you.
Anything else?
Not right now. We're all good.
All right, well, thank you so much.
Thank you. So as I mentioned, we're going to forego the break, but please, if you do need to take a break, feel free to get up and stretch your legs or grab a beverage in the back. We do have our next virtual presenter, John Brecky. And John is our Vice President and Chief Power Supply Officer for Great River Energy. In that capacity, John provides leadership for generation market operations, resource planning, member resources rates, and contracts for Great River Energy. He also serves as the Vice Chair of the Board of Directors for ACES, which is a national energy management company that oversees more than 50,000 megawatts of power generation resources and conducts over $5 billion in annual energy transactions. John has a bachelor's degree in agricultural business management from the University of Minnesota and has previously served as the mayor of Shakopee, Minnesota for 2 years. John, are you there?
Yes, hi.
Hi, John.
Good morning, everyone. I'm so happy to join you. Look forward to the conversation. You've heard from a couple of people from Great River Energy today already about our portfolio and its evolution, from Zach Rizicki, and now about our transmission build-out plans with Priti Patel. And so today I'm going to talk about our experience in the broader regional market, and it's a very interesting topic. I'm glad it's on your agenda today and look forward to your questions at the end, and I can stay around for the Q&A. So we've got some slides today on two basic topics in the energy market. The first being MISO, the Mid-Continent Independent System Operator, and the second being ACES, which is a trading organization that we're a part of that helps manage our book of business in the MISO market. So this map shows you the independent system operators that are in operation across the country. We are part of the Mid-Continent Independent System Operator, and you can see the region covered by MISO. It's a very large footprint. And if you go to the next slide, you can see how it's divided in 3 market areas. MISO North, which encompasses Manitoba, the Dakotas, Iowa, and Minnesota. And that's a very wind-rich region. There's a lot of wind energy in MISO North. It drives prices down compared to other regions in MISO, and we'll talk about the dynamics of that in a later slide. But it's a much different market than other areas of MISO, and it's quite interesting. MISO Central is shown in green, and this is largely Illinois, Indiana, Wisconsin, and Michigan, and a few parts of neighboring states. And then the MISO South system, which doesn't have wind energy to speak of, but has a lot of natural gas generation, and that goes all the way down to the Gulf Coast. So let's talk a little bit about those regions as we think about MISO. But MISO is a not-for-profit, member-based organization. And you can go to that. Thank you. Yes, it's a member-based organization, and it's here to serve its members, which are transmission owners and market entities that serve load in the upper Midwest, and now all the way down to the Gulf Coast. MISO operates the transmission grid. It's an independent operator of that grid, helping provide non-discriminatory access to the grid. MISO plans reliability, and we have responsibilities that we are required to meet in the context of MISO's reliability plans. So MISO develops and enforces those capacity requirements, making sure that load-serving entities like Great River Energy and our member, Lake Region Electric, are meeting our obligations for capacity and reliability at those critical peak times throughout the year. And MISO does that planning for us on behalf of its entire area. And finally, MISO manages energy markets and operating reserves in real time. So those reserves are there and ready to be called upon should interruptions occur. For example, should a generating unit trip anywhere in MISO, MISO is ready with operating reserves that can step in and meet that, ensuring there's not a shortfall or interruption in power supply. Moreover, MISO provides economic generation dispatch. And so based upon demand for electricity in the region, MISO chooses the least cost set of resources to meet that demand in any given condition, any given state or time period. So it's always the next generating unit that is the least cost that's offered to MISO is the next one that they run. That's economic generation dispatch. The cost is measured on variable cost. So think of fuel cost, for example, at a natural gas generating unit. That is the economic basis for the offer price from that unit, is how much fuel you burn to produce a megawatt hour of electricity. And that determines what is the next least cost generator that can run to meet the demand condition. On the next page, we start looking at the impact of MISO statistically. MISO serves 15 states and into Manitoba. 45 million people. Summer peak demand, 127 gigawatts. And the winter peak, 109 gigawatts. Now, those were set some time ago. The MISO footprint changes periodically. And back when those peak demands were set, the footprint was a little bit bigger in some areas of the east than it is today. We're still over 100 gigawatts in all seasons in MISO today. MISO manages 75,000 miles of transmission, so think of GRE as being 2% or so of MISO. Generation, 191 gigawatts. 500 market participants. And the membership is made up of 54 transmission owners. We are one of those transmission owners. Also 143 non-transmission owners. So these are entities that don't own transmission, but that are members of MISO anyway. So there's a lot of members of MISO. On the right-hand side, you can see the breakdown there. 1 gigawatt is 1,000 megawatts, which is 1,000,000 kilowatts. And when you buy energy from Lake Region, it's measured over time. So a kilowatt hour, for example, is a kilowatt purchased for a sustained 1 hour period. Next slide. MISO has an overarching reliability goal, and so do we as load-serving utilities. So we collaborate with the other members of MISO to ensure there's enough available power to meet peak demand at all times, in all conditions. Now, lately that's been more challenging in the winter with extreme cold conditions. So we take wintertime reliability and reliability planning especially seriously. MISO capacity planning involves before the fact compliance. So going into a planning year, we demonstrate as utilities in MISO that we've got the ability to comply with reliability targets for the upcoming seasons. This is a zonal based construct. Our zone here is shown in yellow. Zone 1 encompasses western Wisconsin, most of Minnesota, North Dakota, and parts of South Dakota. And the southern part of Minnesota is part of Zone 3, which is with the Iowa system. So these are capacity zones. We have to demonstrate we've got enough reliability producing resources that can be deployed to serve peak demand all seasons in Zone 1. We also have to do that in Zone 3. We've got some load in that area. So it's a zonal-based construct. Utilities must maintain capacity to meet those peak demands, plus have a reserve margin requirement, which ranges from 9% in the summer to can be up to 27% in the winter. In the wintertime, equipment just doesn't run as reliably as it does in the summertime. In the summertime, natural gas, for example, is abundant, available. We can buy it for our power plants anytime we need it. So we're off peak with heating demand in the summer. So that's one big reason why reserve requirements are lower in the summer. Another reason is that equipment just runs better when it's hot out versus when it's very, very cold. So the reserve requirement goes up a lot in the winter. The fuel system is less available. Sometimes natural gas gets curtailed or disrupted. And we have to switch over to backup fuels, and equipment doesn't always run as reliably in the winter. So we have a bigger cushion in the winter to meet that condition, to meet that time period. Next slide. All of the generation that is provided to MISO is sold into the central market. And that is separate from the transactions where we buy our supply from MISO. So think of it like a cloud. We are selling all of our wind energy, all of our natural gas-based energy, anything we buy on contract from another producing entity. All of that gets sold into the cloud. Separately then, at the same time, we're buying our energy from that cloud. This is a very efficient way to handle the electricity market. We don't have to worry about times when we're slightly surplus or slightly deficit. The cloud takes care of that. MISO balances that. If there's too much generation, MISO can ramp down the highest cost generator that's running on the system. If there's not enough generation, MISO will dispatch the next generator. If we need to dispatch load control, MISO will issue commands and opportunities based upon economics for us to take advantage of prices by running our load management systems. So there's a day-ahead market where all of the planning is done, and that's based upon a load forecast. 95% of our business is conducted day ahead. MISO plans day ahead based upon weather forecasts, what the hourly conditions will be, and the hourly needs to run generators in the market. And these include wind generators. So MISO has, and we have, a day ahead forecast of wind, and we use that to determine our generation curves, our generation production from those wind units, and that goes into the day ahead market. About 5% of our business is the deviation from the day ahead market, and that's called the real-time market, and it's basically a settlement of what actually showed up, what actually happened for load demand versus what we planned, and the same for generation. If there's changes from the day ahead schedule into what actually happened that day, that shows up in the real-time market. MISO manages all of that through this cloud. Next slide. I mentioned that we were in a much different market than the rest of MISO. And so this chart is quite interesting. It shows the fuel breakdown by those MISO regions that I mentioned. So we have MISO North, which is, again, is Iowa, Minnesota, the Dakotas, and Manitoba. It's a wind-rich region. So that's shown in the left here. MISO Central and MISO South. So what you'll notice here is we have this big green area on the bar chart on the left. And the 100% line is the load. It's the supply of energy to meet load annually. So 45% of energy based upon the last 12 months was supplied by renewables, by wind in MISO North. That's a massive amount of production. And we're enjoying the benefits of that in the upper Midwest. Now we're also paying for the cost of that at certain times when congestion appears on the transmission grid because there's a lot of wind production. We do need transmission investments, as Pretty mentioned, to move that wind around and to get it to our load serving utilities like Lake Region. But it's a big advantage that we have in MISO North, all that wind production. Now look at MISO Central. Only 8% of the energy is provided by wind. They've got more solar than we do at about 2%. But even if you total those, that's 10%, much less contribution from renewables in MISO Central. We are blessed with a wind-rich region here, wind-rich production region. MISO South, very little in the way of renewables, and a heavy reliance on natural gas, which is a price volatile fuel and subject to disruption. So price risk of the electricity market in MISO South is dramatically higher than it is here. So we're blessed with some more price stability than what other areas of MISO see. We're also blessed with having less carbon in our fuel mix. There's been tremendous progress made in reducing carbon in the electricity supply in MISO North. Coal still at 29%, natural gas at 14% in MISO North. We will not get to 100% wind energy in MISO North. We will, and it actually, barring a major storage build out. That's the only way you can get to 100% wind energy. You'd have to start storing it in a big way and using it, deploying it at other times when the wind is less productive. So we don't anticipate that MISO will get to 100% wind. There's going to be a mix of fuel types here required to get us to carbon-free in Minnesota, and that will involve, in the long run, it'll involve a big storage build-out. Next. So what's the effect of all this on the seasonality? So this is dividing out that same information and showing it for winter versus other time periods of the year. So in February of 2024, we've got that in the middle chart here. It's the fourth bar from the left is February of 2024. You can see for that month, wind was actually 54%. So we really like the production of wind in the winter months. And that's a good match with our load requirements. Our member cooperatives are using a lot of energy for heating demand in the wintertime, and it tends to be more persistent demand than what we see for air conditioning in the summer. And meanwhile, wind is really prolific in the winter. Wind is much less productive in the summer. However, natural gas is abundant, available, cheap in the summertime. Electricity prices are relatively mild in the summer, and there's a lot of solar production from other utilities on the grid that are ready to be deployed. So you can see that seasonal nature of wind production, and it has a big impact for us, as shown in February of 2024. Now, what's the impact of this on prices? On the next bar chart, you see the price separation that occurred in 2022 between MISO North and the rest of the market. What we enjoyed here was a lot more wind energy production in a year, 2022, when natural gas prices tripled and quadrupled in some cases. And so natural gas supplies were tight the entire year of 2022. Prices spiked, and it caused prices to go up everywhere, including MISO North for electricity. A lot of our electricity is produced by natural gas, and there's a sensitivity, there's a relationship between gas prices and the electricity market price. But we are more shielded from that than other regions of MISO. MISO South is shown in red, MISO Central is shown in light blue on this chart. And typically those prices trade pretty close to one another when gas prices are low. But when gas prices went up in 2022, prices traded much higher in other areas of MISO than they did in our region. So that's the benefit of wind energy in keeping prices more stable. Now, turning to how we manage ourselves in this market, we are members of ACES. ACES is an energy management organization. It's nationwide in its scope, and they help their members and customers buy, sell, and manage energy more efficiently and with less risk. They do a lot of work to manage our risk in the market. We are a member of ACES. ACES is a cooperative. It's owned by its members, and we've banded together with 24 other generation and transmission cooperatives around the country to form this organization. So it's owned by 24 G&Ts and one distribution cooperative in Virginia. They provide services to an additional 60 plus customers nationwide. A lot of different utility types are customers of ACES. ACES has 300 employees with a lot of expertise in the market in various areas, and so we can tap into that expertise to manage our portfolio in MISO. ACES provides individual and portfolio management. Their combined assets total 55,000 megawatts of generation. And so it's a good way to think of that is it's about half the size of MISO in total that they're managing. 55,000 megawatts of load, 3.5 billion cubic feet of natural gas traded per day by ACES. And they're trading out of 4 regional trading centers. Their home base is in Indiana, but they've got a trading center in the GRE office building here in Maple Grove, Minnesota. ACES provides service to its members from those trading centers, and the members are listed on this map in the light blue shaded regions. So those are the generation and transmission cooperative members and their distribution members, shown in light gray. Pretty broad swaths of this country are covered by services that ACES is providing. ACES customer areas are shown in the yellow shaded regions, and the dots represent utilities as well that are either customers or sometimes owners of MISO and their headquarters locations. So what this gives you a feel for is the nationwide scope of the cooperative movement. We as cooperatives have banded together first to form generation and transmission cooperatives. GRE was formed by Lake Region and sister distribution cooperatives. And then those G&Ts form this nationwide energy management trading entity to provide services and to manage risk in the marketplace. Next slide. So ACES provides a lot of value to us. And if we were doing all these services on our own, it would cost us much more. And our depth in terms of bench depth of expertise would be more limited. By serving all these different utilities around the country, we get a lot of bench depth from ACES and a lot of expertise. They're an extension of the members and customers organizations. They provide strong analytics for us and do various market studies of decisions that we're making, either to hedge our load or to provide new generation from a new source. We do analytics with ACES to study those opportunities. They're always monitoring trends, and they're helping us prepare for the future, helping us with hedges, for example, to hedge our risk. They provide a broad range of services that we can tap into, and we are tapping into most services that ACES provides. So they've got a lot of market expertise and strong analytic capabilities. On the next slide, ACES has a national scope, gives it a lot of expertise and experience. They do not trade their own book, so they don't have a book of generation that they're trading or load that they're trading for themselves. They're trading it on our behalf, so they're trading the GRE book on our behalf. It's owned by not-for-profit entities, so it's a cooperative model. We are one of the owners of ACES. They keep our costs down by sharing costs of systems and resources among all the members of ACES. And they are member and customer focused. Their approach to portfolio optimization and risk management is based on participation with us, on evaluating risks and assessing those risks with us, and making a collaborative recommendation on how to manage our portfolio to reduce those risks. On the next slide, we can see the services that ACES is providing to GRE. This is a small sampling of the big services that we're getting from ACES. If we were showing all the services we get from ACES, it would run into many multiples of slides. But they're doing portfolio modeling. So this is computer simulations of our generation and load in the MISO market and what we might see in terms of economic impact based upon various parameters. They're doing forecasting. We need forecasts to prepare budgets, to prepare financial plans, and also to make decisions on generation and demand-side management initiatives and opportunities. We use their forecasts for this. They do daily operations that are essential in the market and required in the market. All of our generation has to be offered into the MISO market every day. We are required to make that available for the use of the cloud, the demand cloud of MISO, and we do that through ACES. They do energy and natural gas purchasing for GRE, and they do settlement management work as well as billing with the MISO system. And that is a very elaborate process with a lot of detail and requires systems and expertise. And my final slide shows a breakdown of the portfolio strategy work that ACES does for its members. And of course, we make portfolio strategy decisions, but we do this with a collaborative partner in ACES that is doing similar work for other G&Ts all over the country. So we can compare notes, we can check in on plans, and we can think about what best practices we want to employ in our decisions on our portfolio strategy. So by having that portfolio and market knowledge, coordinating those hedging strategies, making and deciding on acting on forward recommendations for hedges that we want to place, and coordinating with ACES, we can more effectively position ourselves in the market. So we have quarterly meetings with ACES on our portfolio strategy, thinking about the next 2 to 3 years of market risk. The longer term decisions are made by GRE of how we want to position our portfolio to meet Minnesota's carbon-free standard, for example. But within a 3-year time period, we're very focused on managing our risk. We do this collaboratively with ACES, and we go out and we secure supplies of energy for time periods in which we think we need to reduce our volatility economically. And so we'll go forward, purchase either natural gas or electric power to reduce the risk of the price that we might pay in a forward time period. So very good collaborative process here with ACES on behalf of our member systems. So, ladies and gentlemen, that's an overview of ACES and how we position ourselves in the MISO market. We are blessed with a wind-rich region. Great River Energy, our members, are a big reason why there's wind. We're part of what's built out that wind portfolio. We've got 900 megawatts of wind already in our portfolio, much more on the way, as you heard from Zach Ruzicki, and other utilities are doing the same. So that wind build-out has been a big reason why we have less volatility in our prices. And it should give us some peace of mind going forward on those winter events when it's very cold outside. We typically do have good wind production on average during those events. So thank you very much, Jeff. I'll turn it back to you.
All right, thank you, John. Appreciate that and appreciate you being available for the Q&A session coming up. We have our final presenter this morning, Steve Nisbet. You've heard mention of electric vehicles throughout a number of the presentations today. Steve is going to be discussing the future and potential impacts of EVs. Steve grew up in West Texas, and so you'll hear that. But he's been in Minnesota since the 1990s. He has 26 years of electric utility experience, but of late he has transitioned to that other increasingly aligned utility with the electric utilities, which is transportation, as both a car salesman and now as the EV program director for the Minnesota Automobile Dealers Association. MATA, please welcome Steve.
Thanks, Jeff. I want to thank Tim and the Lake Region team for putting together this panel and for putting together this whole program. It's a good way. This morning you've heard a lot of conversation about all the impacts on the resources from everything, not just EVs. We've heard about a lot of stuff. I'm going to talk a little bit about the EV market specifically and some general terms about what the EV impacts are. So let's see. So let's talk a little bit about the EV market in general. So I'm going to go through a lot of these slides kind of quick, but for years, Tesla and Nissan Leaf were the only real all-electric EVs that were available in the U.S. And increasingly, legislators and regulators decided it was time to drive that back to the U.S. a little bit. And so the IRA Act of 2022 that went into play in August, its intention was to drive manufacturing of EVs to the U.S. So, and supplies for EVs too. So Domestically, all the manufacturers are going to have multiple EV lines available within the next 24 months. You'll see some all-wheel drive SUVs under $55,000. That was kind of one of the things we did not have. Most of them were more expensive than that. You'll see some light-duty trucks. We've seen the Ford Lightning, which has had some success, but it's been stricken a little bit by its lack of towing capacity, I think. That'll catch up over time. I know Chevy's got a Silverado coming out soon, and Dodge has got a Ram coming out next year. Sedans under $40,000, that was kind of a big deal. And then the goal really was to have EVs available in any income bracket. So for a long time, EVs have traditionally been more expensive and only available to the higher income folks. And so the goal was to make it available to everybody. Incidentally, imports have been ahead of the game with options at all price ranges for a long time. And I'm not calling Tesla an import, but they're also one that's got them in all price ranges. So what's happening with the EV market? So the battery sizes, they're going to allow for 300 to 500 miles of range now, most of them. I drive a Volkswagen ID4, which is all electric. It has about 240-mile range. It's an all-wheel drive vehicle about the size of an Equinox. I drove a Nissan Leaf for many years, which was a 2014 Nissan Leaf, and it had 85-mile range. So there was a lot of battery range anxiety from that, for sure. I drove the ID4 up here. It's about 150 miles from where I live. I had to walk over to the RV park and plug it in over at the RV park to charge it because I won't make it back, so on one charge. So driving an EV, the longer range is definitely going to help people that are driving anywhere out state or farther. And the range anxiety is kind of a deal. When you travel with an EV, you've got to do some planning ahead of time. So I had to call the hotel, figure out what the plug style was, make sure I had the right plug, figure out where the location of the stuff was. And like I said, I had to walk over there, which is no big deal. It's a quarter mile. It's no big deal this time of year, but it's a bigger deal when you're talking about the winter time, obviously. You've kind of heard some of this discussion already this morning, but the bigger in-vehicle chargers are putting pressure on the utilities to put in more infrastructure. And incidentally, the manufacturers are not aligned with the utilities or anybody. They're just in there to say, I can charge it faster than anything else. So they don't really care that a giant charger in the car might impact a utility and how utility can serve that vehicle. So a lot of the new ones are coming out with an almost 20 kW charger. And why does that why is that important? Well, I don't know what Tim's average tub size probably is, transformer size is probably something like a 25 kVA. That's going to serve 3 homes. So if somebody goes on there with one 20 kW charger, that's going to potentially overdrive the transformer, which causes infrastructure problems over time, reliability problems. We've heard a lot about reliability. Also causes some safety issues. The onboard chargers that are coming in the new cars now are going to allow for DC fast charging or public charging. That wouldn't go at a house, but it's going to allow for DC fast charging in the 15 to 30-minute range, kind of depending where it's going. Now, there are no DC fast chargers anywhere in this area, so that I had to charge at the lower charge rate. So there's multiple programs rolling out in the next few years to improve public charging availability. Minnesota is just now going to build their first couple of publicly funded charging stations which go along the corridors of 94 and 35. They just released that this week. That was part of a $5 billion program created in late '22, and Minnesota got about $100 million of that. The bigger transformers and infrastructure, those are giant differences in power consumption. So the utilities, there's many utilities in the state of Minnesota, especially that have very small transmission or distribution lines, and they have very small transformers in general, don't serve a lot of big load. And so it's putting a lot of pressure, not only that, but it's a lot of money. And then supply issues on the vehicles in general are getting better. In fact, now we're seeing some oversupply. So it's changing the market just a little bit. So in the EV market, we've moved beyond the early adopter, fast follower phase. So Most customers that were early adopters have already bought one or maybe two or maybe three EVs since that started rolling out in the early 2010s. So the OEMs are all shifting the marketing to all vehicle drivers, and basically that's practicality, ease of use, you know, pricing comparable to similar gas vehicles. So right now an EV, on average, if you buy the equivalent size EV to a gas-powered vehicle, they're about $10,000 difference in price. And so it's still a little bit more expensive. So the goal is to drive those prices down. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about some incentives that have been put in place to help with that. The market is softening a little, and when I say that, I'm saying it's still growing, but it's not growing as fast as it was. And the dealers are having EVs sit on their lots longer than previously. Back when I was in the car business selling cars, we couldn't keep them on the lot. Now they're having them sit. So what that means is the manufacturers are getting super aggressive, offering large rebates and aggressive lease opportunities so that they can move units. So that's kind of their deal, is to show the movement of units. I heard the other day of a dealer leasing a Jeep Wrangler, $75,000 Jeep Wrangler on a lease for $550 a month. So if you bought a car before, you know, $550 usually gets you about $30,000, you know, if you're buying the car. So that's an incredibly aggressive lease rate. And then the residual value on that vehicle is $38,000. Well, when their lease is up at the end of 3 years, that vehicle will still be worth $50,000, which means that they can buy it out for a ridiculous price, or they can trade it back into the dealership. So they're really getting aggressive there to show turns. So obviously there's some pressure to move units. And you've seen them all talk about backing down on some of their battery production, backing down on some of their units that they're doing, so you can definitely see that. So EVs continue to gain market share in Minnesota, but lag behind, you know, on the national adoption. The top selling brand in Minnesota is still clearly Tesla, but we've seen incredible gains in the last year with Hyundai, actually, and Kia, and then Chevy has got with some of their cars. They've got, it's growing. All electric market share in Minnesota for 2023 was 5.4% versus 8.2% nationally. Minnesota increased from 3.8% in 2022. So you can see we saw some continued adoption rates increasing. California penetration rate leads all states, which is not surprising, at 22.6%. They've got the most aggressive rules on emissions that are driving that for sure. And hybrids and plug-in hybrids are gaining some more popularity. They grew in total penetration by about 50% in 2023. And why is that? That's probably because people feel more comfortable, especially in Minnesota, having a gas backup where you don't have to worry about range anxiety. So the average EV is going to add about 30% to a consumer's electric bill per month, and that's an average. That equates to 300, maybe a little bit more kilowatt hours in additional use. So for most customers, that equates to $30 to $40 increase in an electric bill. Equivalent gas is going to run you, it depends on the vehicle, but it's going to run you $400 a month, probably in that case. So it's still incredibly cheap to operate the EV. A little bit, EV market share is a little bit difficult to predict. I know there's a lot of push for it. Minnesota has a goal, it's not a law, but they have a goal for 20% total penetration by 2030. There's roughly 75,000 EVs registered in Minnesota. If you do the math, Minnesota has about 5 to 6 million vehicles registered, so that would mean you'd need 1 million EVs on the road between now and 2030. So most of us don't believe that's a possibility, but we'll see if that happens. And you just think about that, how that is going to impact every network. I mean, we haven't seen a tremendous EV penetration out in rural Minnesota for obvious reasons. No public charging or little public charging, and concern about distances having to be traveled, and also concern about cold weather effects. Which, incidentally, there is an effect from the cold weather, but it's a little bit overblown. I have about a 9% reduction in my total range in the wintertime. So it's not as drastic as what you hear here on the TV. So let's talk about tax credit real quick. So the federal tax incentive that went into play in August of 2022 as part of the IRA Act was intended to be $7,500 credit for new EVs. There's some income and MSRP caps. One of the big rules is it has to be manufactured in North America, which is Mexico, US, or Canada. And in the first quarter of 2023, we have about 100 EV models available in the US, about 39 of 90, I have 39 of 91, so about 39 models were available in the US to qualify for $7,500, okay? So that was in January, basically, of 2023. So starting in April of 2023, material and battery sourcing requirements kicked in, and we went to only 9 models qualified for the full 7,500, and another 6 qualified for a portion of it. And then in 2024, began where dealers can take the tax credit and give the money off the price of the car at the time of sale. But additional material sourcing requirements dropped the total number of eligible vehicles to only 13. So it's definitely dropped. Incidentally, this sourcing requirement is called sourcing materials from a foreign entity of concern, which is a governmental designation. It's basically an enemy of the state. So if you source materials from China, Iran, North Korea, something like that, then you're not eligible for the tax credit. It also means that the manufacturers are struggling to try to fix that problem. So I think the intention of the federal tax credit was good because you're trying to bridge that cost, right, or get that cost down. If you can get the EV within $5,000 of the cost of an equivalent gas vehicle, your total cost of ownership will be lower on the EV. And when I say total cost of ownership, they rarely talk about what the purchase price of the car is and what the purchase, what you're paying in interest. So you got to add all this together. I think the intention was really good, but I think Jim mentioned it first thing today, is sometimes you have laws that are created to be one size fits all. I think it probably wasn't thought through all the way, because if a manufacturer wants to start sourcing materials or building batteries in the U.S., that doesn't just happen in a year. If they want to bring a plant online, that's 5 years probably. And then, you have a regulation with regard to harvesting of materials. So northern Minnesota has some materials for the batteries that could be harvested, but they're being blocked right now from being mined. Let's go on here to Minnesota. So Minnesota, with much pomp and circumstance, added a $2,500 consumer rebate, and law went into place in May of 2023. Much pomp and circumstance, they added that. The idea was to get it within $10,000, right, if you bridge it with a federal tax credit. About 40 models would have a trim level that would qualify. Unfortunately, they capped the availability of the money to where it will just support over about 6,000 rebates. And so the program officially rolled out in late February. You could apply for the rebate. Unfortunately, they decided to make it retroactive to anybody who bought an EV after May 25th of 2023. So the first day that the program rolled out, they got 4,000 applications for the rebate. I checked just a few minutes ago. The total program is about $15 million. It's a one-time allocation. Money is split into Excel and non-Excel buyers. So for you guys as members of Lake Region, we would use money out of one pool. So as of this morning, the non-Excel pool is completely exhausted, and out of $10 million in the Excel one, there's only $400,000 left. So that's going to be exhausted, probably before the end of the month. I guess we are at the end of the month, so early next month maybe. So we're losing a lot of money there. So what's the solution? We talked a whole lot about specifics on resource planning and everything today, and my job at MADA is really, the Dealer Association recognized a couple of years ago that their dealers are being pushed to sell EVs, and they didn't really have anybody that could help their dealers understand EVs, and they also didn't have anybody who could help understand the utilities and bridge the deal. So my job is really consumer education, working with utilities to bridge the time of sale, so we make sure we're getting them on online as soon as possible. So the utility knows they can plan for infrastructure. It also adds a lot of cost to the car and potentially, and so if we could bridge the utility and find out the program, all the co-ops in the state have rebate programs to help pay for charging equipment at the home. But if you've got a buyer that buys a $30,000 bolt and leaves the store with $24,000, $450 a month payment, and they get home on Saturday and they're all happy, they get a fully charged Chevy Bolt and they go drive around all weekend long and burn 250 miles and park it on Sunday afternoon at 5 o'clock and plug it into their 120 circuit because they don't have any level 2 charging at the house and nobody talked to them about it. And then they've got 22-mile range left on the car and they get up the next morning to go to work and they've got 35 miles range because it's super slow on the 120.
Why didn't he plug in over Friday night and Saturday night and Sunday night? I charge my Tesla on a 120 outlet, no problems.
Some people do that, but I'm just saying they don't always know. My position, I guess, is what I'm saying is I'm trying to help the utility and the dealer get connected at the time of the sale, so that when my level 2 guy gets up on Monday and it's got 35-mile range and 45 miles to go to work, so that then they call the utility or they call the dealer or they call somebody and they want to understand why they have to spend another $2,000, and they couldn't come in with a down payment. So there's a lot of people who do charge on 120, but most don't. So most people charge on 240, yeah. The salespeople or buyers don't understand the rate structure of utilities, so they don't really know. Why would a salesperson know what the fuel prices are? They don't know that. They don't understand that every utility in the state has a different rate structure, different pricing, different rebates. We've got some tools that we're putting together to make it where the customer at the time they're sitting at the dealership can go in and figure out what the rate is and maybe even roll in the cost of that into the level 2 charging station in the loan. So it's a lot easier to come up with $34 more a month for a payment than it is to come up with $2,000 and have to wait 30 days or 20 days to get the level 2 charged. So if we can estimate some install costs, we're trying to work with a couple of companies now so that we can have a set install cost for anybody, and so they can just roll that cost into the loan at the time of sale. So I think the last thing I'll leave you with here is that you got to make the kind of the trifecta your ally right here. The consumers are interested in buying these vehicles. The utilities are asked to grow load for the first time in 40 years. But why is it important to get them on programs? Because they need to have the load at the right time. We talked a lot today about that piece of it. Part of it is to make sure that the consumers that are buying the electric vehicles are actually paying for their electric vehicle energy use, and it's not being spread among everybody, so they can get them off the peak or encourage them to pay a little bit more with a different type of rate structure. Regulators and legislators and environmentalists all support the transition to EVs, which is, we've not always been aligned as utilities and as manufacturers and car dealers. We've not always been aligned in that way, and we can try to work together to serve everyone's needs. So I guess the bottom line is the train's left the station, so you can either try to stop it or get in front of it. And that's kind of where we're talking about when I'm talking about consumer education, is the more we can figure out how to place these demand loads at the right time on the network, the better we can do to keep, as we heard today, reliability. We heard all about increased demand. So that's it. So I'm going to be here for the Q&A too. So thank you guys for your time.
Thank you, Steve. Let's give a round of applause to all the panelists today and those online. I've been informed that lunch is here, so it'll be back on a table in the back of the room, just around the corner in the back. And then, of course, after this session at 12:15, we're going to start a series of breakout sessions. The battery storage and generator session is going to be in the Eagle View room upstairs. Well, actually, I think this is the battery storage and generator session right here. Oh, okay. LREC, Local Options, is going to be in the Eagle Room, and then we'll have an EV, a breakout session and panel over in the clubhouse. So with that, I would like to open it up for some questions to the panelists. I think John Brecky is still online as well and may be able to answer some questions if folks have any, and we can get the Q&A started. And I will just offer that there are going to be folks available afterward if you have any individual questions. Yes, sir. Okay. Yeah, so a couple of questions for Steve really is, one is, does the faster rate of charging, increase degradation on the battery at all? And then the second question was related to the increase in the utility bills for EV adopters. Does that include any of the associated infrastructure and improvements that need to be done to accommodate that? So if you have to increase the transformer size or increase any of the conductor sizes, is that part of that equation?
So on the battery piece, that's an excellent question. At the level 2 charging rate, which is 240 volts, those power levels that I talked about today are not going to degrade the battery over faster. Where you do reach some issues with degradation of the battery is on the DC fast charging. We're starting to get higher and higher rates of that. And that, if you do it over time, all the time, that will degrade the battery. But most people charge at home. It's up around 90% of people charge at home all the time. So you're using a level 2 station or the 120 potentially. I have had an EV on and off for 10 years, and this is probably only my 25th time to publicly charge. So the point is, most of that charging is at home. But if you plan on, the DC fast charging is great for bridging something. If you needed to go to Fargo and you want to stop off in Alex and DC fast charge and get to Fargo, and then you go to your hotel in Fargo and you plug in at 120 and you'll be charged for your way home, and you might have to bridge it in Alex on the way back. The $30 to $40, it's also an excellent question. That's just your monthly kilowatt hour increase. That doesn't include if you had to come to the table with some infrastructure costs. And those can range from, anywhere from a typical 200 amp panel home with the panel in the garage. It cost me about $1,200 to $1,500 to do that at my house. But if you have to improve the transformer and the line that goes into the house, and potentially some other pieces, your panel may not accommodate some of that stuff. Some people's panels won't accommodate a 100 amp breaker because their panel's full, and so you might run into $10,000 there. So there's substantial differences. And one of the things I didn't mention is that even if you have a bigger charger in your car, you do not have to charge at the higher charging rate. So you can put so if you go call your electrician and you call your utility and they say it's going to cost you $10,000 to get this 19.2 kW charger in your house, well, how much will it cost me if I put a 12.2 kW? Or don't, to his point, right. And they say, well, that'll cost you $350 for the improvement in your panel, and then it'll cost you $700 for the deal. So you got about $1,000 in which the utility will give you some of that money. And since you're charging overnight, most of the time, you're not required to charge in 5 minutes or even an hour or anything like that. Most people actually don't even exhaust, 15 to 20% of their battery on a daily anyway. So, to the guy that asked about the Tesla or whatever, charging at 120, you may not need it depending on your usage structure. So for me, when I commute I work from home mostly, but when I commute into work, that's 70 miles each way. And so then I've got to charge you know, I'm going to be exhausting it if I'm going into work every day. I'm going to be using it. So, excellent questions.
Do you have?
No, I was just comment, my upgrade, I did upgrade my local panel, but it was a 32 amp fuse put into the existing panel. It cost $250.
Okay.
Most of that was for the line, the fuse, and the hours paid to the electrician to do this.
Certainly.
electrician certified.
Yeah, and it's really, it's a good point. It's all kind of variable depending on where you want to put your charging station. I ran mine up on surface mount conduit over my garage because the panel's in front of the garage. And I wanted the charging station to be at the end so I could park outside or inside to charge. So
I went cheap, I didn't use the charging station, I just put a neat 1450 on the wall. Plugged it in.
I put an extra one of those too, actually, just in case my station went down. So
We got one question back here. Go ahead, sir.
I just want to piggyback on this. We've got a breakout session after lunch with Steve and a bunch of EV owners. And, you know, I do a lot of research before I hop on AV. But the best way to learn is to talk to other EV owners, test drive with an EV owner, talk about those scenarios, about how did I get my house ready, what's it like charging every night, whatever. So we're excited to answer all these edge cases. And even after our breakout session, you know, we'd be happy to answer that kind of stuff. That's how you learn, that's how you get used to it. And really, these things aren't really that scary. In fact, it's oftentimes a better experience than charging or putting up at the gas station. So we're excited to talk about these things in the breakout session.
All right. Well, yeah, more to come in the breakout sessions. There was a question back here. Yes, sir.
If you guys have been reading the papers, Minnesota has a lawsuit against it now. Missouri has brought a lawsuit on the energy policies of Minnesota, California, Connecticut, Rhode Island, Jersey, those out there. How is that going to affect our energy policy? And then, Derek, you know, what side are you going to be on? Legislators, what side are you going to be on? You're not on the board, so you probably don't have to answer, but I'll let Derek take that question, what side he thinks he'll be on.
Could you just say another couple words about which lawsuit you're?
The Missouri lawsuit on energy policy.
Are you talking about against the EPA plant rules? Is that what I think you're probably referring to? There's several states that have.
Yeah, there's 13 states.
Yep, yeah.
Policy.
Yeah, and Jim referred to that at the top in his presentation a little bit. The NRECA and co-ops generally are very concerned about slow down the shutdown is the way I kind of said it, but very concerned about the pace nationally of plants shutting down. And I'm pretty sure that's the lawsuit, because that's the time frame that you're thinking of, and the states that have joined that. And so that's against the Environmental Protection Agency, against the EPA in the U.S. DC Circuit Court, to say that the regulations that the EPA has proposed to rapidly advance the shutdown of coal and gas plants are a bad idea, basically. And so that's something that, yes, co-ops are concerned about, both nationally as well as across Minnesota. Of course, in Minnesota, we also have a 2040 carbon-free bill, which I kind of gave some background on. That's a separate piece of state legislation that's also creating a similar dynamic. But yes, we you know, if those plants are shut down before there's other generation available, we're worried about the reliability and affordability impact. So NRECA has been working on that as well, and is also actively participating as a national organization in trying to get some changes to those EPA regulations to keep the system reliable.
Go ahead, Zach.
I think I'm off. I'm on now, okay. I just wanted to piggyback off that for 1 second. There are provisions in the MISO market tariffs that do provide for the ability for MISO to require power stations to stay open. So even in the event that EPA were to require a shutdown, MISO can designate a coal unit or a gas unit as what's called a system support resource and compensate that market participant for continued operation of that asset. So, I mean, we could find ourselves in a position where multiple ISO, RTOs like MISO, like PJM, like SPP, find themselves at odds with the US EPA in requiring stations to shut down while the market is requiring stations to stay open. So there are provisions to ensure reliability, and that is MISO's job, is to ensure reliability, and that's why those mechanisms exist. I'm sorry, I'm unfamiliar with the carbon tax issue right now.
That's what they're saying. It's 5 states want a global carbon tax on traditional energy industry.
Perhaps they're characterizing the EPA regulations as a carbon tax. I'm not sure.
We'll have to follow up with that after. Yes, sir.
Can I get you to mic here?
All right. Sorry, Steve, sorry for heckling you during your presentation. Apologize, it was just, so with, mostly directed for Derek, you were talking about, and to the gentleman in the back's comment, about home solar being financed and subsidized by other members for certain members who can afford to install it. Does the co-op see individuals installing home solar as an asset? Is that something that's going to be a long-term benefit to the co-op for generation?
A number of us may want to take a swing at that, but
Sure.
but I'll but yes, I'd say you know, Lake Region has a program to help members install home solar, and and again, as I mentioned, I think both at grid scale and at homes, we're going to see a lot more solar as we move forward in this industry. It's going to happen, and that's a good thing, and it's good at both scales. I think the concern is how the cost. Who pays and where's the money move around as that continues? That's the concern, not whether it should happen or not.
Okay, and then the follow-up to that would be, if we reduce the current rate, which you propose there, if we're reducing the current rate that's paid to the individuals who generate at home with their solar, what kind of offsets do you think would be good to continue to make home solar financially appealing? So if I can't recover the costs to installing a system in a reasonable amount of time because of the rate reduction, I might not install home solar. So what other programs do you think would be viable then to continue to make that financially appealing for the members?
Sure. Yeah, let me
Jump in on that. Early in my presentation, I talked about our first solar venture, and that was community solar, where we built it, owned it, operated, and members could buy subscriptions and receive that solar as a bill credit. That's one way to kind of equalize the economics across the membership. Our Go West program is a little different. It's an option to the state mandated net metering rules in Minnesota, which requires us to buy that output at the average retail rate. And so just in a real simple example of think of it being a business, to buy your wholesale product at a retail rate, you can't make that up on volume. So that's the concern, the fairness issue across the membership. So I think we've got to continue to work on this issue and make it a little more balanced across the membership. But we're under the state laws, and I think that's what Derek was getting at. That was put in place a long, long time ago. Things have really changed and matured since then. The question is, does that formula still make sense for us? Does that help?
Yeah, and this could potentially get into that. You know, you mentioned in your comments, Derek, the size to load, you know, as a potential solution. You know, it's one thing, like, as a load modifying resource, you can offset a lot of your other consumption. It's that question of if I have the means and the wherewithal to build something that is, you know, twice as big as what I need with the expectation of selling that excess back, is that a viable and equitable, you know, option for the rest of the membership? Yes.
I think, I just want to add to that, this topic, the key to that is battery storage. And so as you have residential or commercial solar outside of the electricity company or co-op, the key is battery storage, and then smart use of when the co-op or the grid buys back that power. And that's what's going to be changing over the next 10, 15 years, is that's the game changer. And, you know, yeah, you can have some benefit when you're generating the solar and giving it right away, or offsetting with your own local usage, but it's the battery storage is the game changer, which will make any investments that individuals make or corporations make a value add to our local grid, because that makes our local grid stronger, and our local grid doesn't have to pay all the infrastructure costs. So the real key is virtual power plant and the way that we can collaborate with our local grid.
All right. Oh, one right here.
Yeah, excuse me. I just want to make the point that when you're discussing what I would call cost shifting by an EV coming online, bear in mind that people who make efficiency changes also cause cost shifting. And that any cost shifting, any reduction in my bill that I make due to improved efficiencies, I recover at retail rate. So why shouldn't EV recover at retail rate also? Or not EV, but PV.
PV.
I guess it's kind of already been covered. I would say that's very much in line with the size to load kind of comments that Jeff just made. And we are early on in working what we believe the policy solution ought to be precisely, but thinking about this size to load concept is really important as we think about it. So to the degree you're offsetting your own load, it's, you know, it looks just like your energy efficiency. To the degree you install solar that's 4 times what your load is, and you're now, instead of zeroing out your bill, you're getting a big check from the rest of the people on the system every month, that's not the same as energy efficiency.
Right, and typically you don't get retail rate for.
Yes, you do, under current state policy.
Okay.
Up to 40 kilowatts, you get retail rate. Over that, you are paid avoided cost rate.
Yep, up to 40 kilowatts. State laws currently, you get your full retail rate, which is roughly 3 to 4 times the average household energy use.
All right. Is that it? I think that's it. Everyone's hungry. I'm seeing some pleas. Well, thank you, everyone. Again, folks will be around both after the panel, after this, for any questions, as well as during the breakout sessions. Thank you so much for your time and attention today. And again, thanks for your engagement as well.